The universe is like tapestry, carefully woven with dancing colours. However, pull apart at the seams and the entire thing comes crumbling down. The universe is the great tapestry of one sole individual, Aurora Stelliferus, a celestial among mortals. She was born from the aftermath of the gargantuan explosion that birthed the kaiju of our universe. For in the beginning, there was nothing, an endless and desolate void that held nothing. No light or dark, life and death, it was an end with no beginning. Nothing existed. That was until what can only be described as a miracle happened. A lone spark of a yet unknown power ignited into violet waves of fire that spread across the void for light years and showed no signs of stopping. Creating vast nebulas, galaxies, and other manner of cosmic wonders, stars were born, creating the first existing particles of light that cast their rays out into the once everlasting darkness, extinguishing it forever. This was an inconceivable phenomenon that defied all odds, and from the epicenter of the explosion, another star was born, though this was no ordinary star. It was the burning wonder that gave life to our universe, an energy that we would know in name as the Essence. The Essence was an almost sentient life form, a golden light that, like DNA, had instructions to create. Using the other stars as relay points, it is the very DNA of the universe, the very thing that allows life to exist, for without it, we would all reside in darkness. Then, for reasons yet unknown, its power began to bond with those first existing particles of light, and began to create a sight what could only be described as pure impossibility. A humanoid figure that stood at 10 feet tall, with wings sprouting out from her back that were double her size. Her skin was a soft grey that felt like snow to the touch, as her eyes were filled with a crimson sea that encapsulated the stars themselves. This was Aurora Stelliferus, the first life form in all of creation. Looking around, she saw a sight to behold. The universe freshly born, with stars and galaxies that were born minutes ago, and that were still being born. She had no words to describe what she was seeing, even though there wouldn't have been anyone to hear her words. And though she was born mere moments ago, the knowledge and power from this star filled her head instantaneously, filling her with knowledge that did not yet exist in writing, nor any other physicality. The star, or rather, the Essence, had passed down its instructions unto her. The role of a celestial was to see the gift of life thrive for eternity, and to prevent the nothingness from ever returning. Or at least, that was what was originally intended. Whether it was born from a misunderstanding, or pure selfishness, it seems Aurora would have different ideas. Harnessing her power and knowledge, she took hold of the Essence Star itself, and with all her might, she trapped it in her grasp, as in the blink of an eye, she removed both the star and herself from the universe. Seconds later, they would reappear, but not where they were before. Now they were in the nothingness. More specifically, they had reappeared outside of space and time, where the light had yet to reach them. Looking down from where she was, Aurora could see the universe from above, its stars and galaxies still burning anew. Next, Aurora turned her gaze towards the star. Conjuring all the knowledge that the star had given her, she had created a spherical prison of the strongest materials yet unknown to mankind. The star could no longer spread its divine power, and was thus sealed away for eternity. Over the course of many millennia, Aurora would build herself a castle of wonder, spires that reached high, as every wall of the castle was crafted by her hand and built to ultimate perfection. Alongside this castle, she built an endless horizon of dystopian factories that formed a ring around the castle. These factories were to produce everything and anything she needed to keep her tyrannical eye over the universe. Manning these factories would be poor and near broken life forms known as lesser forms. These half-witted creatures born from Aurora, whose entire existence relied on following orders. However, the more she created, the emptier she was becoming inside. It was a feeling she had tried to ignore for the longest time. She had everything: power, control. What was this invisible force that drove her to near madness? No matter what she would do, or no matter how many lesser forms she would destroy for her own amusement, she would feel more trapped each time. It was then that because of this, she used her power to give life to two other celestial beings. Casting her hands forth, a golden light poured from her to create these two new beings. But more than that, they were Aurora's new sisters, now known as Luna and Helena. Now Aurora had everything and more. The universe would now bend to her whim, and should they step out of line, all hell would be let loose upon them. But, although its divine power was sealed away, a silent scream was heard bleeding from within its cold confinement, calling out to the other stars in creation, begging to be freed, and the call was answered. One day, deep within the sea of stars, an explosion occurred. At first, it was nothing special, but when the smoke dissipated, that was when the true aftermath of the explosion could be seen. A brand new galaxy was born, shrouded in a cloud of essence energy. It was a majesty to behold, as a new name in legend was born, the Galaxy of Harmony. But the galaxy did not come alone. It too was joined by a celestial being, born exactly like Aurora was. Unlike Aurora, however, this celestial was a kind and gentle spirit, understanding her true purpose as protector, not oppressor. Harnessing her power with all her strength and might, she blesses a boulder in outer space with the essence energy as she sends it flying at light speeds towards one of the planets within the new galaxy, as it crashes into its surface and embeds itself within its core, empowering the planet with the arcane power. Aurora, witnessing all from her throne via technology produced from her factories, takes this as an insult and as a sign of war. However, before Aurora's blind rage takes hold, her sisters relay that they should invite her to the castle and discuss the matter rather than to convert to war right away. For the universe, it is lucky that Luna and Helena are sisters to Aurora, for they are the only people in all of creation who Aurora would heed advice from. As for the universe, it now seemed their fate was in the balance. But if war was to begin, it is uncommon for opposing forces to meet prior to the breakout to talk amongst one another. Luna Stelliferus was sent out across the stars to find their mystery celestial. Meanwhile, Aurora spent her time conjuring over a map of her universal glacier, inspecting every fine corner of creation, and smiling to herself at the marvel that she had created. All the while she had slaves bleeding and dying in her name, all to soothe the ego of this celestial tyrant. Returning home, Luna presented Aurora with who they had been looking for. Stepping aside to make way, the celestial before them was the very definition of grace and elegance. Like Aurora, she stood at 10 feet tall, her royal purple hair gingerly traced along the floor, while her wings were a beautiful array of shapes and patterns that, when folded inward, formed what looked like a spider's web made of glass. Upon her chest was the birthmark of the galaxy that she was born from, blazing for all to see as her dress radiated royalty and power. Looking upon her, she was the complete opposite of Aurora. She was Lady Lilac. Aurora inwardly snarled as Lilac walked towards her to greet her with kindness. Snapping her fingers, a dozen subservient servants all rushed to the bottom of the stairs that ascended to her throne. As Aurora walked down them, the servants then bent over with their backs to the air. Aurora walked upon them, her combined weight nearly breaking their backs. Lady Lilac did not openly express her feelings of this, but it left a first impression nonetheless. The Celestials then made their way to the Great Hall to discuss the issue at hand. Before they reached the hall, however, they first made their way through a corridor, simple as it may be to the likes of Aurora and her sisters, but to Lilac she was astonished at the sight before her. Stars encased in chandeliers of pure diamond, the extensive windows that stretched from the floor to the ceiling, with their geometric stained glass that shone an array of different colours from the starlight outside, filling the corridor like water in a glass. The walls of the castle were handcrafted from a marble-like material that were also a part of the gargantuan pillars that towered above all. This was just one corridor in one part of the castle, and while she did not speak a word of this, Lilac was taken aback nonetheless. When they arrived at the Great Hall, the sight before her was even grander, similar in fashion and style, but on a scale that was nearly impossible to comprehend. Scenery aside, they made their way to a table which awaited them with many a choice of drink to choose from. As they sat down, they began to discuss a multitude of topics, beginning with Lady Lilac herself. She tells them how she was born from an explosion that ripped waves in the fabric of time and space, creating a galaxy alongside her, as is the birth process of all Celestials. Lady Lilac then beckoned a question to Aurora. Lilac, being a Celestial, could feel that the universe had no source of energy to keep it alive, and that it would only be a matter of time before stars would start dying, and galaxies devolving before all that would be left is the darkness that heralds extinction. Aurora then took one final drink from her glass, before snapping her fingers again. As the magic flowed from the tips of her fingers, a large clicking sound was heard, and the floor beside them began to part, revealing an empty abyss below. A low rumble was heard from the abyss, as a contraption began to slowly rise from the dark. A large spherical object that nearly resembled an eye, glaring at any who looked towards it. As the contraption snapped to a halt, a mystical fog flowed from the abyss. Lady Lilac looked onward at the construction as she walked toward it, placing her hand upon the sphere, focusing her mind. She began to hear what sounded like multiple whispers calling out to her. As the longer she held her hand upon the casket, the more the whispers grew into cries, and the cries grew into shrieks of terror. These cries of agony forced her to rip her hand from the sphere. As she looked on in horror, she quickly realized what she was looking at. It was the same prison that Aurora constructed long ago. Turning towards Aurora, Lilac, riddled with distress, asked how she could do something like this, to lock away the star that holds the shrine of life in its divine light and power. She snarked. She expresses that she had the right to do so. She was the first life form in all of creation, the one responsible for everything around them. The universe bends to her every whim. What have they done to deserve a gift such as this? Lady Lilac then turns the question onto her. What right did Aurora have to hold this power for herself? It was the job of a Celestial to prevent damnation, not to deliver it. Lilac's words fell on deaf ears. Aurora held her stand and merely gestured that if Lilac disagreed so much, she could simply just leave. Lilac did not waste any time in doing so. Rising to her feet, she beckons to Aurora that if she proceeds the way she does, she will not be the one serving damnation. Helena offered to show her the way out, to which Lilac accepted, leaving the room to Aurora and Luna. Luna turns towards Aurora, asking what good any of that accomplished. Aurora then snaps at her, smashing the glass beneath her fist. This was not her idea, it was Luna's right from the start. She had no intention of having Aurora join them, let alone become friends. And with that, Aurora rises to her feet and retreats to her chamber. But before doing so, she reminds Luna that while both her and Helena were sisters, to remember where they came from and that they should know their place. What could have been a peaceful resolution to a misunderstanding was now thrown out the window. Now only one option remained: war. As the doors to the castle were sealed behind her, Lady Lilac made off with great haste to return home. She returned to her home within the galaxy of Harmony, on a singular planetary system that was empowered above the rest. She touches down on its soil. Solace and solitude surrounds her as the gentle planetary breeze caresses her body. She draws in a deep breath, focusing on her surroundings and sharpening her mind as she pulls her hands towards her chest. Her eyes snap open, and with all her strength, she lets loose her powers before her as a great golden light roars forth from the palms of her hands and splits off into 7 different streams that scorch the ground they impact. Seconds that feel like eternity pass before the golden light begins to form shapes, growing taller as they begin to form bodies that stood silently before her as Lady Lilac retracts her hands. 7 unique souls all stand before her as they all begin to take their first breath of life, their eyes taking in the scenery around them for the very first time. Lady Lilac addresses them toward her. They know not who she is nor what they are themselves, but like the birth of a Celestial, knowledge fills every corner of their mind. Lady Lilac then begins to explain who she is. She explains the role of a Celestial in the grand scheme of the universe, and how it is all of them that must fulfill this role. The souls understandably respond to her with confusion. They were born just mere moments ago, and now they were being asked to monitor a whole universe. However, this was to be the easiest task that Lilac would ask of them. She then tells them of the galactic tyrant, Aurora Stellafaris, and how she seeks to not only abuse her power, but also seek to wage war on the people of this galaxy. Silence falls over them, and it is then that Lady Lilac finally stops. She thinks. Drawing in a deep breath, she begins from the start. Minutes had passed. Many questions were asked. Lady Lilac answered them as best as she could until finally, after what felt like centuries, they were all granted clarity to the situation. The souls begin to understand, slowly taking in who they are and what they would commit themselves to band together and take down Aurora. Though this would be no easy feat, it would take them many months, perhaps years, to come close to challenging her, but they must begin somewhere. Lady Lilac then proceeds to appoint them as planetary leaders, as well as giving them names as individuals. For as much as they were Celestials, they were also friends amongst one another. Aristus, protector of Kagavai; Dracidus, protector of Toilanai; Takao, protector of Intrepid; Isao, protector of Phoenix; Ivadon, protector of Vanaheim; Fedona, protector of Termini; and Zenoa, protector of Genovia. They would watch over their worlds, to watch it grow and evolve over time, but they were to not make themselves known to the people of their planets. After all, it was their job to protect them. If Aurora was to somehow sense they were a part of it, her retaliation would show no mercy. Now it was time to begin. Lady Lilac would now train her pupils in the art of their power and capabilities, for they would need to work together in harmony as a united creed if they were to succeed. And it was upon this day that the Alliance of Harmony was formed. Annoyance and anger festered and whirled together in unison. The longer she waited, the more the storm grew. Aurora had spent many days figuring out a way to destroy Lady Lilac and her galaxy once and for all. But problem after problem kept arising and made all this needlessly difficult. The main problem standing in her way was the fact that Aurora, her sisters, the entire galactic bubble of the Celestial Symphony was a secret to the universe. Not one living soul knew of their existence. This meant they could not simply march on over to the Galaxy of Harmony and remove it from sight without risking everything they had built. This led to Aurora sending her factories and its workers into overdrive to try and find a solution to this growing annoyance. Many lesser forms tried to suggest ideas to Aurora, but any she deemed as ineffective saw those lesser forms removed from existence, their very mind, soul and body eradicated with the wave of a hand. Aurora had confined herself to her private chambers, her head racked with ways to come up with an idea, but coming fruitless every time. That was until 3 silent knocks were heard coming from her door. At first, she ignored them, not wishing to speak with anyone, but then they happened again and again and again, until finally Aurora marched over to her door and opened it with great force, the door nearly torn from its position, her eyes seeded with rage as they looked on to see who was disturbing her. But soon her eyes quickly faded from anger into slight surprise. It was her sister, Helena, asking if they could come inside to talk. Aurora was a second away from turning her away and asking to be left alone, but her own mental strength had caved in, and so she invited her inside. Aurora's room was outfitted and carved with every rare and precious gemstone known in the universe. A faint blue light hung in the room as the starlit galaxy shone through the windows, casting onto every surface. It was a sight to behold, and only 2 people throughout the entire universe had ever seen it. Helena asks how she was feeling. Aurora was reluctant to share her feelings, only answering that she was fine and that she was merely fatigued from her duties. But before Helena could ask if that was really the issue, Aurora demanded to know that if she only came to speak about their feelings, then she can leave now. Helena frowned slightly. She was hoping to get closer with her sister to see if she could offer her help, but any chance of that happening was thrown out the window. Instead, she proposes an idea for Aurora about the thorn in her side that was Lady Lilac. She says that if Lilac could have her own galaxy to do with as she pleases, then why couldn't she? Aurora turns around in confusion. She already has a galaxy, that being the Celestial Symphony. Helena shakes her head and tells her to make a new galaxy, one separate from their home and one that could live within the universe without the wider universe garnering suspicion about their existence. Aurora's expression then turns to intrigue as she asks her sister to explain her idea further, adding on that it would be a simple species, one with the sole existence to seek out a new home from their own and destroy it over time. This way, not only would they rid the universe from the filth that plagues Aurora's domain, but it would also keep their home a secret. The universe would be none the wiser. Aurora turns back. She doesn't say much, but she thanks her sister for the advice and then promptly asks them to leave. As Helena stands up and walks toward the door, she silently turns back to her sister, the same frown still upon her face as she feels disappointed that she could not break through her sister's barrier. And with that, she leaves. Aurora is now left alone. Silence swarms over her as she ponders. The past few days of mental anger had proven tiresome. Nevertheless, she has finally found her answer as she collapses back upon her bed behind her, resting her eyes as a smile crept upon her face. Time is an essential factor in warfare. It can be the make or break in a side's goals to achieve their brutal desires of victory. It allows for the building of materials, the training of soldiers, and above all, an eerie shadow to see which side will strike first. Years had passed since the creation of the Alliance and the forging of the sword against tyranny. Lady Lilac had trained, harnessed, and perfected the power that her friends now yield. They were now stronger than ever, and now with the news unveiling that Aurora had developed a new weapon that would cause suffering untold, they needed to strike now. Standing atop a mountain, Lady Lilac watched as the sun was setting over the horizon, as all the people and creatures of this world were beginning to slumber, whilst those that belonged to the night were beginning to emerge. She watched as the world she empowered sleep, for what would potentially be her final time. Turning around, she is greeted with the other members of the Alliance, who had now arrived at the top of the mountain. They all know that their time has come, but they all remained silent on the matter. Instead, they crack jokes, share smiles, and bolster each other with confidence and compliments. They had worked hard to get here, and soon the fruits of their labour would soon flourish. Before they would depart, Lady Lilac offered to those that wished to stay may do so, and that they would live free from cowardice and know that there would be no shame in backing out from what would potentially be their final bow. None of the members of the Alliance backed down, and instead they stepped forward, raising their fists in the air and proclaiming that they would hold their resolve until their final breath. She smiles, and thus they depart for deep, deep space. They arrive at the dead space, a point in creation where the walls of the universe ended and all that remained beyond was extinction. Breaking through the boundary, they look onward into the distance, where there lay their ultimate test of strength, the very thing that Lady Lilac had told them many tales of, but this was their very first time seeing it. The Celestial Symphony, and inside, the castle that was home to a power-hungry tyrant, the Akagi. Arriving upon the outskirts of the galaxy, they look on toward the castle, its sheer size daunting, as the architecture was unlike anything the Alliance had ever seen before. Even for Lady Lilac, with this being her second visit, still could not comprehend what lay before her. An array of gold and white shades formed the castle, a stark contrast to the decaying, decadent, and dystopian factories that lay all around them. Death and smog filled the air, making the stench unbearable. To their surprise, all was quiet. Aurora would have known the split second they left their galaxy, and yet all that lay before them was silence. However, they were no fools, and instead they proceed toward the castle with caution, anxiety clawing at their stomachs and lodging within their throats. They were halfway to the castle gates, when suddenly, the hair on the back of their necks stands to attention. They all share the same look, turning toward their comrades to verify that they all sensed it too. They turn around in the blink of an eye, weapons drawn and body and mind at the ready. But to their surprise, it was not who they expected. Inconspicuous and nearly unnoticed, Luna Stelliferus stood before them, silence looming over her. Lady Lilac steps toward her, calling out to her. Luna did not respond. Instead, she kept her head low. No one could see her face. Step by step, Lady Lilac draws closer, until she stops right in front of her. She reaches out, until suddenly her hand snaps back as a shriek is heard before them. They all turn to face the origin, and there beholds a haunting sight. A staff-like weapon impaled right through Fidona's heart. She stands there, words failing to form as a singular tear is shed from her eye. Cupping her hands to the wound, she looks back up to her family one last time before she falls, never to rise again. This reveals their embodiment of hatred, Aurora Stelliferis, standing proud as an ear-to-ear smile widens across her face. A roar of laughter erupts from the Mad Titan as she glows a bright and burning golden orange. Her true power is revealed, and her wings stretched outward. She lunges for Lady Lilac, whilst both Luna and now Helena band together to take on the other members of the Alliance. The fight for the fate of the universe had begun. Valiance was displayed throughout, as it seemed the ego had clouded the sisters' opinions of their opponents. They re-evaluated, and with the combination of their arcane abilities, they began to damage and stagger the members of the Alliance. Lady Lilac focuses all her rage onto Aurora, her moves flowing with a mixture of grace and anger, all whilst Aurora continued to smile, taunting her the entire time with words that knew would get under her skin. And at the same time, a cry was heard. It was Drakidas. However, it was not he who was mortally wounded, but Aristus instead. He too had been slain. Lady Lilac watched on in horror as now two of her friends had fallen. Anxiety and worry now struck at her heart, wondering if she had failed her friends in their training, and instead of coming to claim victory, she had instead brought them to the slaughterhouse. Using this moment of distraction, Aurora uses her power to push Lilac away, far enough for her to turn her attention to the remaining members. Mercy did not exist in Aurora's vocabulary, as one by one she hacked and slashed, blood spilling across her face and armour, all whilst the same dastardly smile remained. Lady Lilac watched on from afar as she rushed to get back and join the fight, knowing that with each second she struggled meant another member would die. Isao, Takao, Drakidas and Zenoa all dealt what damage they could, but in the end, it was all in vain. Ivadon now stood alone, the three almighty Celestials standing before him. Closing his eyes, he accepts his fate. Until another shriek is heard. This time, however, it came from Aurora. Lady Lilac had sliced her hand clean off as Aurora's weapon falls to the ground. Struggling in agony, her sisters rushed to see if she was all right, and whilst that was taking place, Lady Lilac turns to Ivadon. She tells him they must make great haste to the castle and find the galactic archival room. As Aurora slowly recovers from her wounds, she slowly rises back to her feet. She looks in front of her, ready to unleash revenge upon them both. But to her surprise, they were no longer there. Instead, to her horror, she sees the gates to the castle wide open. Haste could not describe the urgency and speed at which they were both moving at, their breathing becoming sharp and raspy with each step as adrenaline kept them from slowing down. Taking each corner sharply, they eventually find themselves at the archive. A titanic thud from Lady Lilac brings down the door as they enter the room. Lady Lilac places the door back and uses her power to mend the lock, buying them precious seconds. They look onward. The room was a near dark void, only visible from the gargantuan holographic light that displayed the universe before them. Every star, galaxy, nebula and planet were mapped. There was no corner left uncharted, no stone left unturned. Lady Lilac places her hand upon the interface as she works her way through the different zones and sectors that had been marked and divided on the map, until finally she finds it, the Galaxy of Harmony. She looks upon her home one last time as she smiles, tears falling from her eyes as she knows what must be done. Placing her hand upon the map, she closes her eyes, focusing her mind. Seconds that feel like eternity go by until suddenly, the galaxy disappears from the map. It is done. Lady Lilac turns one last time to Iverdon, tears still flowing from her eyes. All the while Iverdon doesn't understand what's going on. Confusion and fear hang in his throat as she gives him a final, tear-filled goodbye. She begins to share all the wonderful times they had all spent together. Suddenly, thunderous strikes were heard coming from the door to the room. With no more time, Lady Lilac takes hold of Iverdon's hand as she says her final goodbye. She uses her power to send Iverdon home, back to the Galaxy of Harmony, where he will be safe. She turns to the door, where there stood an enraged Aurora, her blood boiling through her with fury as she bares her teeth at her. Screaming and cursing her name, Luna and Helena both step back as Aurora leapt forward with all her strength as she tightly grasps Lady Lilac's throat. Aurora whispers into her ear how everything she loved will be purged, and that even from beyond the grave, she will hear her people scream for a mercy that will never come. Lady Lilac, struggling for air, begins to chuckle, chortle in her face as Aurora looks on in confusion, wondering what she could be laughing at when she is seconds away from death. That was when she felt a hand on her shoulder. It was Helena. She was looking at the galactic map with a face of dismay. Aurora turns to the map. She falls silent as her heart sinks to the floor. All the data that was gathered and accumulated was deleted, as well as removing all the surrounding data that would have linked to the location of the galaxy. Centuries of progress wiped in seconds. An inexplicable anger swirls inside her, like a raging storm ready to strike down on a village made from wood and stone. Her hand tightens its grip as Lady Lilac begins to cough and spurt blood, all the while Aurora's gaze never moved from the map. What was mere seconds felt like a lifetime to Lilac, as her death was an excruciatingly slow and painful, until finally, the edges of darkness were closing in on her as she breathes her last, never to wake again. Aurora loosens her grip as Lilac's body slumps lifelessly to the floor as silence fills the air. But it wouldn't last for long, as suddenly a titanic shriek bellows and howls from Aurora as she lets loose the rage she had built up within so powerfully that the entire castle begins to shake and pieces begin to break off. Luna and Helena stand helplessly at what to do, both knowing that in this moment, nothing would bring her back to her senses. It seemed that from this fight, everyone had lost. Reappearing just seconds later, he is still filled with the panic and anxiety from all that had occurred. Looking around, he slowly begins to recognize his surroundings as he now stood alone amongst the plains of Vanaheim. Alone, cold and afraid, he has no one to talk to release his sadness from within as tears swell and fall from his eyes. He screams in agony as all he once knew and loved had been taken from him. They had all lost, and it seemed that all hope had vanished. But he knew this could not end here. He had to forge onward in the name of the fallen, in the name of his family. Solitude hangs in the air as he slowly walks on into the distance, wondering where he would go from here on out, as it seemed Ivadon would begin a new journey of his own, and only time would reveal the road ahead for him. Harmony, a state of balance between all living things that allows for light and dark to coexist in peace with one another. Long ago, rumors had spread around the cosmos of a legend known as the Galaxy of Harmony, a solemn plane of existence that within harbors the very epicenter of legend. The 7 planets formed as any other had done throughout time, large pieces of rock and boulders culminating together to form several gargantuan behemoths. However, it was one planet that became legend among the rest. From unknown territories to us, a boulder had fallen through the void from places far beyond legend. The boulder continued to fall until it had crashed through the planet's surface and embedded itself within the planet's core. It was then that an unnatural phenomenon occurred, as a rather strange, enchanting magic began bleeding from the boulder and started to merge with the core. Suddenly, due to reasons unknown, the magic began to seep its way back through the layers of the planet. Once reaching the surface, the essence began to feed its way throughout the planet as it spread across the entire surface. Suddenly, the essence started bringing life to the planet of nothingness. Nature began to flourish, as endless fields of rock turned into soft plains of grass that expanded for miles. Trees started to erupt from the cracked surface, becoming guardians of the ground. In what seemed like a matter of minutes, the planet had gone from a world devoid of colour to a heaven filled with life. And yet, the magic did not stop there, as it started to give life to several unique creatures as bodies started to appear from seemingly thin air. It proceeded to do this until it had given birth to around 100 of these unique, soon-to-be colonies. Without knowing anything, each and every one of them started to sing praises of this mystical force. Centuries would pass, as the original 100 living beings had expanded into thousands, living inside a vast kingdom of thriving communities. Residing within the very top of a mountain, surrounded by valleys and hillsides, the kingdom had itself a palace that would shine when the sun lay its rays upon the castle walls. This shining beacon of community would become known as the Phoenix Crest, named after the planet with the very same name, Phoenix. The people of this world used the essence in everyday life to benefit the kingdom. However, they also knew of the unholy levels of power the essence could bring, and thus, a kingdom-wide competition was held. The strongest competitors would become the new king and queen of the kingdom, and indeed, the world. The competition tested their strength, endurance, physical and mental awareness, all aspects that needed to be covered to ensure a strong lead would sit upon the throne. After many days of near back-breaking work, 2 victors came out on top. Their names were Acarnus Dawn and Eventide Silka. Together, they ascended to become the kingdom's protectors and newfound rulers. Round about the same time as they were chosen, a theory was going around the kingdom. If they were born into being via this essence, would it be possible to create a child of your very own using this essence? Thus, they decided to test out this theory to see what the results would yield. They were astounded. Through a combination of their blood, the essence began reacting and building a DNA construct that mirrored Akarnas and Eventide's very own DNA. It was then that the dust had settled, and what lay in front was an infant child, the very first to be born from this new experiment. This was the birth of Gastrolite Dawn. But unfortunately, happiness was merely temporary. Moments of joy would soon turn to gusts of anarchy when one day the king and queen were having their coronation to celebrate their new lives as well as the life they had brought into this world. It was then that an explosion went off, bringing down pieces of debris from the castle walls. The king and queen took cover from the ensuing chaos as several guards were thrown high into the air. This attack was brought about by anarchists who outright rejected the thought of the monarchy. To them, two nobodies had been made charge of a world that had gone just fine without them for many years prior. Leading this attack was a madman by the name of Nadir Helmfire, and it was upon this day a civil war had broken out, pitting the forces of harmony against the colony of madness, as bloody fights began to break out across the land as both sides struggled to gain control. A call was sent out across the stars by the Phoenix Crest, and to their luck of fortune, the call was answered. A nearby planet by the name of Vanaheim sent out a small force consisting of King Ivadon and Queen Tassia, alongside the Royal Guard. The negotiations went on, and in the end, a deal was forged. However, no Covenant mission is made free. Thus, a deal was made in return. King Ivadon requested that when the war is won, they ask as a symbol of their alliance to be forged as one, to continue onward after the war, and to help both planets elevate to new heights, as well as of smaller and finer details to be worked out in time. Thus, the contract was made, and the two worlds began working as one, and the war started to swing in their favour. At the same time, Gastrolite was starting to become good friends with one of the royal guards of the Allied world. This royal guard were an elite fighting force of warriors from across their kingdom that devoted their life to the cause. One of the warriors had attracted the attention of the young prince. She was a rather strange being to him, as two distinct differences stood out about her. Atop her head were large pointed ears that stood out. Then there were the large flowing tails behind her that softly glowed in the sunlight. This warrior's name was Larnia. Together, the two spent much of their time with each other, enjoying their time as childhood friends. And thus, it was here that saw a pivotal moment shift within time, as fate would soon lead the course of the next few years. Many years had passed, during which the war had become a deadlock of blood soaking the fields of what was once peaceful land. From atop the mountains, smoke and flame could be seen scarring the sacred soil they once walked upon. For many years, it seemed like there was no end in sight, but through trial and tribulation, battle by battle, death by death, the colony of madness were finally pushed back to the gates of their revolt. The final assault was imminent. A battalion was readied, a combination of soldiers from all across the kingdom, as the strongest warriors from each colony prepared themselves for this fight, alongside a force from Vanaheim. It was now time for the Phoenix to face the devil. The force began marching out. Many days and nights came and went as they travelled far from hither and yonder, drawing ever closer to the pit of hell as they passed by sharp, jagged valleys and walked through fields of tall grass. On their way, they witnessed the harrowing sight of the dead that lay before them. So many battles, so many losses. The king and queen swore that once this was over, they would memorialize all those who had fallen. They began to encroach upon the final valley, where beyond the steep hillsides, there lay the manifestation of evil. What lay ahead of them was a fortress made of stone, compacted together with brightly boiling magma as smoke bellowed from the inside. Atop the walls was a nightmarish sight of barbed wire. Entangled with it were the bodies of the fallen soldiers as the wire hung them and pierced their fragile flesh, leaving stains of blood pouring from the wounds and drying out on their faces that beheld their final moments of pain and terror. This was no ordinary outpost, nor was it an average holdout. This was the home of the damned, Fortress Abominitude. Rather strangely, there were no defences surrounding the fortress. It was left open for anyone to walk up to and get access. However, looks can be deceiving, as this is exactly what the colony had planned for. A sudden rumble could be felt coming from the ground around them, as everyone began to steel themselves for the coming attack. Suddenly, hands started bursting from the ground as they grasped the dirt and started to pull themselves up from the surface. What they saw were the colony soldiers. However, they were not how they were when the war started. Each one of them had died 1,000 times over, only to be brought back by the essence. However, due to how many times they had been brought back, they no longer represented who they were before. Their soul, mind and heart had been consumed and had become one with madness. Their bodies were a horrid sight of blood and guts hanging from their open wounds, as their skin had turned a dingy grey. No longer could they call themselves people. They were now slaves to the war machine. The Royal Guard had formed a vanguard around both kings and queens, as the soldiers of the colony began to hurl themselves toward the battalion. While the soldiers were mere mindless husks, they could still pose a great threat when equipped with sword and shield. This led to the battalion having to escape the entrapment by forcing their way through the horde. In the end, the battalion had overcome the danger. Some had become scarred with wounds, but they were still strong nonetheless. They began clearing the land of the dead and any debris that littered the area. The reason for this was to make way for the large artillery pieces ready to pound the fortress. These cannons were designed to weaponize the essence. Once King Acarnas's staff was inserted into a device separate from the cannons, a wire trailing them would receive the signal and would begin feeding from the staff's power, blasting away at anything in their path. Post-haste, Queen Eventide commanded the forces to clear the way and allow for the barrage to commence. Silence befell the battlefield as the order was given by King Acarnas. A devastating wave of energy roared from the cannons as the energy sliced through the air and collided with the fortress gates. This continued for several minutes until the cannons came to a stop and the dust began to settle. As for what lay beyond the cloud was a large opening in the fortress. However, eerily, the fortress lay silent. No sign of enemy activity. The battalion started to encroach on the fortress, and as they stepped through the gates, that was when the colony soldiers appeared from their positions, and thus the fight for Fortress Abominitude had begun. The first phase was to claim the courtyard and the surrounding walls. Chaotic fights ensued from the mindless monsters of the colony, threw themselves forth without thought or hesitation. The soldiers of Harmony fought valiantly as the enemy came on stronger and stronger each time. Gastrolite had thrown himself into combat as he fought them off one by one, slaughtering all in his path. He turns to see the king and queen smile upon him. They couldn't be prouder of the boy who would one day take their place on the throne. After what felt like eons of fighting, the courtyard was safely secured, and everyone sheathed their swords. A soft wind blew through the air, soldiers to a neutral, calm state. However, the fight was not over yet. Rather, it had only just begun. Retrieving a map of the fortress from the remains of the dead, the kings and queens discussed a plan on how to execute their next move. They all discovered that the fortress held an array of underground tunnels and rooms the size of colosseums. They saw that right beneath them on the map was a large central room that held 3 separate doorways that led to different areas of the fortress underground. Now armed with this knowledge, the soldiers spent their final moments resting as the order was given to move out again. The underground entrance lay just beyond a large wooden door that, when pushed open, revealed a spiraling stone staircase that led down into the catacombs of hell. As the soldiers wandered down the stairs, the faint sound of torches cracking through the air could be heard, as the equal sound of weaponry tapping armor could also be heard accompanying the unionized march. After what felt like an eternal descent, eventually they come across a large open colosseum held up with titanic pillars of stone. In front of them were 3 large-sized doors made entirely from wood, with barriers on the lower half to allow for people to remove them and open the way. Exactly as the map foretold, the kings and queens then decided to split up the force amongst themselves, as they would each take a section of the paths that lay ahead of them. But, unbeknownst to them, a worse situation was soon to descend upon them. Scuttling and cackles could be heard coming from up high. However, when the soldiers looked upward, all they could see was a dark void. It was then that one soldier fired an arrow into the clouds of darkness. Many quiet, eerie seconds went by, until suddenly a corpse fell from the ceiling and splattered onto the floor, blood and guts flying from the smashed corpse. It was then that several blood-curdling screeches started descending from above them as more mangled and contorted soldiers began their attack upon the battalion. The ravaging creatures tore into the ranks of the battalion as several began falling and succumbing to the attack. It was a massacre. King Acarnus watched on in horror as his fellow soldiers were being gutted, decapitated, and contorted. However, the king had an ace up his sleeve. Feeling that his staff had regained its energy, he gave an almighty cast onto the ground. This released a wave of purifying light that spread throughout the Colosseum and burned away the creatures of the colony. Silence befell the Colosseum. The creatures started falling from the ceiling and slamming on the ground with a resounding splat, sending even more blood across the floor and on to the nearby soldiers. It seemed that all enemies had been banished, but this was still not the end yet. King Acarnus ordered a short rest period for the soldiers to rest and recuperate before they would head out again for the final time. Now it was time. The soldiers all banded together once more and were separated into 3 smaller forces. One force commanded by King Ivadon, the other by Queens Tassia and Eventide, and the last by King Acarnus himself. Acarnus headed toward the central door and pressed forward, no one knowing what horror could lay further beyond. As they continued to walk through the endless darkness, another gargantuan door lay in front of them. Strangely, however, this one had giant claw marks that stretched from top to bottom of the doorway. Taking note of this strange observation, they proceeded to heave the door open with all their strength and might. As they poured through the doorway, the room ahead of them was another large open space. This time, though, A giant pit lay before them. The pit went down for miles as the sea of darkness flooded the entire crevasse. But something far more horrifying stood at the apex of the abyss. There stood the very reason for the war's existence, the reason why so many had died in the pursuit of justice. However, he was not the same man he was before. This man was now consumed by the war. Much alike the soldiers, he had died many times over on the battlefield. But unlike them, his appearance was different. He was now the embodiment of stone. Magma flowed where blood once did, as it helped hold his body together. Not even the essence was enough to keep him alive now, as his body had undergone extreme change. This man was Nadir Helmfire. Staring down the king with an evil glare, he beckons toward him with mocking intent. He yells towards the king, calling him an old righteous man, forever marching the plains of this world in the pursuit of his victory. The king replies with a soft anger in his voice. He comments on Nadir's appearance, how he is now the embodiment of war and an amalgamation of the dead. Nadir laughs, for while he may have lost his mind and soul, what had Ekarnus gained? He had won the war at the cost of so many, a Pyrrhic victory that had forever scarred the land and its people. He remains silent as he struggles to find the words to respond to Nadir's mockery. That is when he snaps, yelling to Nadir that this is his final chance, surrender or face annihilation. Nadir responds that the euphoric sensation that his death would bring would be over in mere seconds, whether he did it here and now or with the kingdom watching. Nothing will ever bring back the soldiers and friends he had lost along the way. How was he to justify the losses to the grieving mother crying over the grave of their beloved child? Ekarnus falls into a shell of silence, as it is then that Nadir reveals he never intended to win the war. He had purposefully dragged it out over these long, bloody years, orchestrated every battle to ensure the largest number of dead possible. A song whose vocals are sang with the screams of the dead. Nadir had no intention to kill the king either. He would have gladly let him and Eventide live. All he cared about was that both of them had lost the will and power to be king and queen. The room falls silent as Nadir finishes his speech, everyone feeling the impact of his words. None more, however, than the king, as in that very moment the world around him had crumbled down. His hands bore so much blood. In the end, everyone suffers all the same in war. But before anyone could speak again, Nadir fell to the ground as he began to writhe in agony. But he was not wailing in pain. Instead, it was a horrific concoction of laughter, as that laughter turned into growls of discomfort, as everyone began watching on in horror as Nadir's body started to grow and contort into a horrific mass, watching as the slate of stone fell from his body to reveal the magma beneath, as before they knew it, Nadir had become a gargantuan monster of untold proportions. Staring down at the enemy, a wicked grin grows on his face as lava falls from his gaping maw, as he then points toward Ekarnus to proclaim that this battle will be his last as king. For from this, his people will revolt and demolish the eyesore that is their castle. But this did not faze the forces of harmony, for just as Ekarnus loses all hope, He turns to see his soldiers raising their fists and weapons alike high into the air and proclaiming that this is victory or death. It seemed Nadir had underestimated the will of the people, as when Echarnus too raised his staff into the air, the soldiers let their voices of freedom be heard as the chasm filled with their war cry. Echarnus pointed his staff towards the nightmarish Nadir, as his soldiers all charged into the beast. The fight for fate of all those in the kingdom now rests upon their sword and shield. In the beginning, Nadir made short work of many of the soldiers, crushing many beneath his feet, slamming them against the walls and even picking a few of them up and tearing their bodies apart with his bare hands. But Nadir had not expected the sheer number of soldiers before him, as he had hoped by now they would have given up in hope or perhaps switched sides and joined his renegade. But alas, they were bound in unison as many began to strike Nadir, and while these wounds were negligible, in the long run they would lead to unexpected ruptures in his body, as though he had transformed into a monstrous-like being. He still possessed organs and blood vessels that his weary, war-ridden body desperately needed to stay alive. As the soldiers launched their spears, fired volleys of arrows, and hurled many explosive weaponry to strike him where it hurt. Echarnus then leapt into the fray, using all of his fury he had kept locked inside, and unleashing it upon his nemesis, as Nadir watched on, cackling to himself as it seemed he had finally broken the king, who was now open in all his truth for all to see. Suddenly, Nadir begins to strike his fists against the walls of the underground, and punching the ground above him in an attempt to cause a cave-in, as large chunks of rock and debris began falling to the ground. In great haste, Echarnus cast his staff to force the door wide open, as he commanded everyone to retreat to the surface. As they retreated, they found themselves regrouping with the other forces, who too had felt the mass collapse that was imminent. Together, they made a mad dash for the exit, as the falling rocks drew ever closer. Finally, they had found the exit, and when they did, in an ironic twist of fate, that was when the entire fortress had collapsed, and while the vast majority were clear from the wreckage, many were unlucky and lost their lives in the collapse. The air became intoxicated with ash and smoke resulting from the ensuing calamity, making it almost impossible to breathe as everyone wandered aimlessly through the haze of the battlefield. But the madness was far from over, as before they knew it, the ground around them began to shake violently, as it seemed the very ground beneath them was being torn apart like paper, to reveal the mad Titan himself. It appears he had survived the cave-in, as he climbed his way from the debris to tower over the soldiers. Letting loose a cry, he grew ever more insane as it seemed any of his attempts to destroy them were outwitted by sheer luck. But he was through with this. Here would be where he made his final stand, and where he would see the fall of Echarnus. Towering, thundering, and striking the ground around him, he let madness consume him, as it seemed all his attacks were more erratic than coordinated. And while many had fallen to these violent, unpredictable attacks, in the end, the united army banded together to unleash their arsenal of vim and vigour upon the Titan, as in the end, his body began to fold and crumble as his size started to decrease, until he was nothing more than a weakened man of magma, bleeding across the battlefield. He looks up to the forces before him, cursing them all as he proclaims that if he cannot win this fight, then neither shall they. Retrieving a sword from a nearby fallen soldier, he made a beeline for one person in mind, Gastrolite, Acarnas's son. Fighting valiantly, Gastrolite had stunned not only Nadir, but everyone around him as he held his might against him. However, a slight mistake in his attack pattern led to Nadir slicing Gastrolite right across the eye as his blood stained the sword. Witnessing this, and before Nadir could retreat, a vengeful fueled Larnia had thrown herself against him, releasing her anger against him, as she almost proved too much for him, and indeed, if it were not for a piece of her armour had fallen from her leg, that allowed for Nadir to plunge his sword deep within her thigh, she too had fallen to the ground, wincing in pain. And with this, Nadir used his remaining strength to retreat back to the fortress underground. The kings and queens rushed over to the two wounded warriors as small pools of blood began pouring from their wounds. Inside what remained of the catacombs that had not been caved in, Nadir crawled and stumbled his way to a hidden room deep in the underground. There, he was greeted by a strange hooded figure, who stood before a cauldron that was bubbling and spitting a strange dark energy. Nadir greeted the strange figure, as if he knew exactly who he was, as he handed the blood-stained sword to them. Taking it from him, they broke the end of the sword that was painted with blood, and proceeded to drop it inside the cauldron. When they did, a violent reaction begins to occur, as the room was filled with a blinding golden light, as the blood and dark energy began to form as one, filling the room with a deafening noise until it finally died back down. What was left from the resulting reaction was a soul, bound together by the blood of two warriors. But this time, there was one slight modification. The process was stopped just before the reaction could be completed, leaving what was left behind in the cauldron to be the soul of another living being that, in order to be completed to form the body, now needed unprecedented amounts of energy to kickstart the reaction again. Encasing the essence in a vial, the hooded figure set it atop an altar. When asked by Nadir what any of this was for, they proclaimed that they had been contacted by higher forces, who had spoken to them in their dreams, ordering them that if they wished to one day avenge this war, this strange and rather bewildering ritual must be performed. And with that, the hooded figure proceeds to leave for the surface, where he would go to pursue this new mission of theirs. But before they leave, they hand Nadir a dagger without saying a word, and instead looking upon him as if he expected to know what he needs to do. Taking the dagger was enough of a confirmation as they leave the room and seal the door behind them. Falling to his knees, a final smile encroaches upon his face, as when it does, Nadir plunges the dagger deep inside and slices his stomach wide open, coating the walls and floor around him in magma as he falls to the floor, his body giving out and losing its shape as it pools on the floor around him. And with this, finally, after so long, Nadir Helmfire was dead. Now turning to the sun-graced land above the underground, a crowd of laughter rose as songs of victory filled the air. The kings and queens all shared their gratitude and for their efforts, knowing that the outcome would have been much different without them. As for Gastrolite and Larnia, they both had their wounds tended to, and together they embraced one another, hearts intertwined as one. King Icarnus then rose to a high position to overlook his soldiers. Soldiers, kings and queens, today we have earned a hard-fought victory, one that has put an end to tyranny and a life of tribulation. You will all be honoured, your names and efforts etched into the sands of time. While we will celebrate this victory, let us not forget those who died to bring us here. Friends, family, comrades, all will be remembered. Let us head back properly. We must celebrate this day. Together, everyone banded together to return home. One more march to victory. As when they did, the streets were littered with celebration. The bells rang out across the kingdom. People welcomed home their children and loved ones. Parades were held, as at long last, a ceremony was held to celebrate the love of now Princess Larnia and Prince Gastrolite, as Icarnus and Eventide announced their step back from the throne to make way for the new royal couple. A new dawn was to begin for the planet Phoenix, one of peace and prosperity. However, fate would have other plans. Centuries pass, the Phoenix Crest now live under the rulings of King Gastrolite and Queen Larnia. Together, they brought the kingdom to new heights as the word of their kingdom spread far and wide. But it was time for this planet to turn a new leaf. One day, from origins unknown to us, colonizers from another world arrived to make this planet their home. Post-haste, Gastrolite and Larnia used their powers combined to mask the kingdom to keep it protected from overseers, meaning anyone on the outside would simply see mountains and hillsides. And with this, the kingdom would never be seen again for many years to come. As for the colonizers, they spent day and night to search for a place to call home. They tirelessly searched the desolate fields, and that was when they found it. A large, abandoned structure that was claimed by time and nature, with no signs of life inhabiting within it. This was where the colonizers would make their home, and thus brings the end to a tale of old, where kings and queens fought hard for peace, only to be hidden away for what would feel like an eternity. Life. It's a gift from the universe. We know not of its origins nor its purpose, yet we all live each day like it's our last. But much like any gift, we take it for granted, never appreciating its true value. That is how the people of this world view their gift, breaking it down bit by bit until they reached the apex of damnation. This world, once a shining beacon, was now a decrepit archive of what was soon to be the once was, rather than what is. The lakes ran black with poison and toxic sludge. The landscape was a shadow of its former self. Trees had lost their leaves of colour, were now naked and withered. As for the sky itself, it whirled in a never-ending storm of black clouds and raging storms. Yet, in a rather ironic twist, a decadent beauty sat amidst the cesspit. A large-scale metropolis with beaming towers that pierced the sky, constructed of the finest raw materials that could be gouged from the planet. This mighty splendour was known as the Citadel, that within lay the last chance of hope for this world. Contracted by the government, an intelligent group of people were founded to find a solution to start reversing the seemingly irreversible damage that had been done to the planet. Using technology to find a causal root, they found something that lay within the sky. When staring high, to the naked eye all that could be seen was a thick black blanket that covered the heaven's stars above. Presumed to have been clouds, no one ever thought to search deeper inside. However, when analysing the clouds closer, what was found caused imminent concern. They discovered a form of bacteria that had evolved into a leech-feeding parasite. These creatures of unknown origin made the sky their home. The reason for this was due to the fact they could not breathe the air outside of the clouds, or they would die. However, many thousands had ventured out, and as any parasite knows how to survive, they made their way inside the airway passages of the people down below, and would proceed to feed from their brainwaves of positive emotions, leaving the host a husk of negativity and an aura of darkness. Not knowing where these creatures had come from, they had no way of knowing any weakness to exploit against the parasites. Many plotted absurd ideas that were either impossible or funding could not be granted. More days went by as hope faded with each passing hour. However, if hope could not be founded, then a glimmer of intrigue could. Below the main tower of the citadel is where the scientists operated, working day and night to find a solution against the growing calamity. The scientists had discovered something that was again unknown in origin, but was yielding positive results in testing. Years ago, when the ancient colonizers had arrived at this planet, they had built their home atop the ruins of an old battleground. Assuming whoever created these structures were long dead, they made their settlement here and remained to the present day. But to the more important matters, the catacombs of laboratories all converged on one central room, held up by 4 large pillars as scientific equipment, scanners, lights, sample analyzers all littered the ground around them. As for what they need this equipment for, lay in the center of the room, a stone altar with emblems and ancient text carved within the sides. The majority of these writings were unintelligible, written in a language they did not understand. Rather strangely, however, there were writings upon the stone that read like instructions that were made exactly for the scientists and their predicament. Words reading, "Salvation, your future rests in here, and I am your only hope." Atop the altar lay a stained and withered glass capsule. Inside was a captivating arcane magic that danced and revolved inside its glass prison. Many had tried to understand exactly what it was, and while many tests and experiments showed its properties, none could understand its nature. Desperate for any chance of resolve, the scientists conducted experiments on infected civilians whose parasites had them on the verge of death. Exposing them to the magic found that their mind would burn and eyes glowed a burning orange glow as the patient would exhale a thick black smog that would dissipate when exposed to the open air. Afterward, the patient would collapse in a weakened state. A moment of euphoria flooded through the room as each scientist knew they had found the solution they had been desperately searching for. All that was left now was to enact action. But before that, they must hypothesize on more theories on how to spread this arcane miracle. They first thought to distribute it in the form of a cure. However, the essence was too small in its amount to spread across the city. Then there was the idea of replicating the essence, But this task was too difficult to conduct, as it would take technologies unfathomable and years to begin breaking down its inner workings. Turning back to the drawing board again, they pondered on how to get this magic into direct contact with the sky. With this, not only could they solve the magic shortage problem, but it would also ensure it spread around the world, as theory figured that contact should ignite a chain reaction across the sky, if the experiments with the various parasites were anything to go by. Days of tireless work came and went, but with each passing day, the hour of prosperity would soon be at hand. In the end, the time of success had come. After months of hard, sometimes unforgiving work went by, the fruits of their labour were finally ready. The construction of a special propulsion system in the form of a singular, large cannon-like weapon. As for its intended purpose, they had hypothesized a scenario in which the propulsion weapon would shoot the magic high into the atmosphere, in a type of shell which would explode once it reached a certain point in the atmosphere. And as they theorized before, that would ignite the atmosphere, burn away the parasite infestation, and save the planet. But while theories are all well and good, the real result would come in practice. In a desolate field, far away from the citadel and its inhabitants, they had erected a site for the propulsion weapon, with workers in protective gear and tinted goggles to protect them against any fallout or failure in the system. After all, these people were tampering with forces beyond their knowledge. Anything could happen, no matter how much testing they had done. As when the scientists arrived, they walked toward the weapon, as one of them inserted a special shell inside its designated spot and closed the port. "Clear the area, all personnel behind the yellow line," one of the scientists demanded, as everyone on site moved away like a horde of animals being shifted by the farmer. As the scientist entered the final code, they then retreated to the safe area, as silence flooded like moth to a flame. Distant sounds of the machine could be heard. Lights flickered as the machine came to life. Seconds like eons went by as everyone watched with knots in their stomachs. And then it happened. A bright flash of white light appeared and then disappeared in a matter of seconds, as a bang reverberated and pierced everyone's ears. A long faint white line followed the device, as the shell soared at high speeds faster than sound, charging straight toward the sky as it would soon be swallowed by the abyss above. Then, after more antagonizing seconds, two strange shapes began falling from the sky as they impacted the ground below and embedded themselves in the dirt. As one of the hazmat-protected personnel approached one of the objects, they picked it up from the ground and started to analyze it. "Hey, it's one of the shell pieces." As they started speaking, they were immediately cut off as a bright orange flash filled the sky and crawled its way across the entire atmosphere, burning the thick clouds as it did. The people in the citadel ran rampant with panic, as for all they knew, the entire sky had lit on fire with no explanation. Had the gods turned their back on them, leaving them to rot in eternal damnation? Or, as many did wonder, were there any gods in the first place? However, alongside the chaos, many of the civilians had their minds burned from within as the parasite became intoxicated and absorbed by the purifying air. Nevertheless, after minutes of these scenes of hell, the fire began to retreat to its point of origin as it all culminated together and in the blink of an eye disappeared into the void beyond the sky, never to be seen again. Silence returned once more, as everyone, both in and outside the citadel, looked on at the sky. A bright blue azure lay like a soft blanket across the whole world, wrapping it in its calming embrace as the sun had graced the land for the first time in what felt like centuries. As for the scientists, songs and cheers of praise were sung of their triumph, as they were heralded as saviours in the end of days. As for their reward, the government gave them a substantial funding to establish themselves and lay the grounds to start building an empire of prosperity. An empire that would carve its family name deep within its roots. Malachi. Rain hammered the isolated streets. The outside world was a scene of tribulation, as darkness reigned on its throne of torment, as all light had faded from a world once divine. However, while the outside world was one of despair, the inside of one building proved the difference between night and day. Outside the building, a low, droning buzz could be heard coming from a flickering neon sign that clung against the violent winds. The sign read Adoption Center. Inside was a depressing scene. The walls were painted with colours that had faded into deep crimsons and ghastly greens as the wallpaper began to peel and flake away, as well as random assortment of toys that littered the floor. Many of them had broken parts or faulty electronics. Although to any conscious mind they would see this as a depressing sight, in the eyes of a child, the saying, "ignorance is bliss," would always prove right. Even for the souls left behind that lived under this roof. One day, a child had appeared on the doorstep of the adoption center. On the door to the center there was a sign stuck that clearly stated to not leave children outside and to bring them in to sort out the situation. But when one worker turned up that day, they found the sign ignored and the child left in the rain. Sighing to themselves, they pick up the child and walk into the building. As they place the child on the counter, they begin to unwrap them from the blanket they were tightly fitted into. As when they did, the worker found a strange piece of paper that fell to the floor. Picking up the paper and unfolding it, they found writing upon the note. Name, Raven. Age, 6. I'm sorry we couldn't hand him in personally. This has been a very hard decision for both of us, but we're in no current state to give him the life he deserves. Please take care of him and give him to another family that can provide for him. Thank you. Giving the note a look of sadness, they scrunched it up and discarded it in the bin. As they did, they took the child and placed them in a room with all the other children, who were just starting to wake up. There, Raven sat alone and confused. Little would he know, this was the beginning of a far frightening dawn to come. 2 years had passed. Raven had come to know everyone in the center, mainly the staff. Not many chose Raven. He was never sure why, but that feeling wouldn't last long. One day, a family looking to adopt came into the center. It had just passed Raven's 8th birthday, so what would make a better gift than a loving family to come and take him with them? Signing the papers, Raven left the center behind to start a new life. Or so he thought. Once they arrived home, the sun quickly faded over the horizon to lift darkness once more. Both parents bellowed like titans, cursing each other with words of torment. Arguments stemmed with little to no context, and because of this, Raven would be caught in the war zone. The walls were filled with muffled screams, as was his mind, causing sleep to become a tantalizing dream. However, in time it would end. A day came when, to Raven's salvation, a worker from the adoption center had been receiving reports from the neighbors of yelling coming from the house. Investigating further, they could see the endless flood of tears crawling on Raven's face, as he had sprinted to the worker to seek safety behind them. While the parents aimlessly scrambled at any excuse they could muster, the worker refused to listen to them, and after removing all ownership from them over the child, Raven returned to the adoption center. The next few years had gone by as the days began to merge as one. Raven hadn't left the center since his first time, nor did the memories of when he had. Turning 11 years old, Raven tried to look past that point in his life and move forward. To help him with his goal, it so happened a new family came into the center for a new member to join their family. What was not to like with them? Smiles stemming from ear to ear and eyes full of care. Spotting Raven on his lonesome, they wander up to him and ask how he'd like to go with them. Seeing hope in their eyes, he gives them a strong affirmation. And with that, new papers were signed and Raven was sent on his way. Little would he know he would come to rue this day. A whole house with rage seeded in the walls. Verbal and physical threats of violence were screamed across the halls, as over time the house became an endless maze of hiding spots that Raven would use to hide away in the shadows, as his only friend would be the tears that accompany him in these times of turmoil. He also began to have nightmares of extreme anguish, as even in the world of dreams he was not safe from their endless agony. Only so much could be taken. One day, the family had left on an outing, and had left Raven all alone. However, when they returned, they found their front door wide open, and the whole house was devoid of life. Raven had left, running away to the only place he felt safe. The adoption center became Raven's real home. There had been many times where he was the only child left in the center, both out of Raven's fear to be taken again, but also for the families that had chosen the other children instead. While the workers did all they could to make him feel at home, there was never anything more they could have done outside of that. But that didn't matter anymore, not to Raven, for by now his pendulum of peace had shattered. Years of solitary confinement, years of abuse, pain and agony, all culminated into the revenge-filled man he had now become, as he swore he would transcend above everyone else, and make them live the same torment he had endured all his life up until this point. But for now, Raven would have to wait. Growing older, Raven had become wiser and colder over the years, more pain festering inside his soul. But now the time for waiting was over. A day had come when contractors from a wealthy business had come to the adoption center as part of a plan to renovate the building, or maybe even a new facility to work with. Raven, while he didn't know who the people were, was no stranger to the outside world. Malachi Industries, the supposed light in a world of darkness. A few more days went by, and as they did, a surprising revelation had come to light. As part of Malachi's parental program, The owners of the industry wanted to kickstart this new endeavour by adopting a child into their family. It was to Raven's surprise when he found out that he was the one chosen by them. But alongside this surprise was an endless wave of euphoria that flooded inside of him. While part of him remained skeptical of this family, those theories would soon be laid to rest when he could see that the Malachis were kind and caring people. But that didn't matter anyway. All this did was cement the fact that he was now a part of one of the most powerful organizations the world had ever seen. And with this, Raven had found the key to his new journey, one of both revenge and a twisted perception of vengeance, as the world would come to bitterly regret the day Raven Malachi was born. As time marches on, so too does the march of progression follow closely behind it. Together, the three heads of Malachi Industries pushed it to new heights further than anyone could have predicted, turning the Citadel from mere humble beginnings into the heart of the planet and its people. The three heads of the industry were as followed: Matthias Malachi, son of the previous owners at the industry, and had now been given the responsibility to carry out the dream that his ancestors had forged long ago. Melanie Malachi, wife of Matthias and head of the People First campaign, as in her kind heart she wanted to lift people from the cold clutches of poverty into the warm embrace of furnished homes and well-paying jobs. Then, lastly, there was Raven Malachi. He had joined the family when Matthias was still young, and they ended up growing up together. While Matthias was the older brother, Raven was always the misfit out of the two of them, always seeming to find a way to make any situation out of his control conform exactly as he wanted it to. At Malachi Industries, Raven was the head of the technology department and would construct the things that were once thought impossible. To many at the industry, this seemed like it was asking for trouble. However, Melanie and Matthias both knew of Raven's devilish tendencies and would always keep him at an arm's length in the industry until he could fully earn their trust. Raven was no fool to any of this, however, and merely played along with these games of theirs. Often at times, Raven would invite their suspicions on by playing smaller games that would invoke their reactions, as he would laugh endlessly when he tricked them. But in the end, these games were stalling Raven's progress. If he wanted to reach the position of total control, he needed to act now, and was now more a perfect time than ever. The past few months saw Melanie's work slow down more than usual. The reason for this was to be the joyous news that she was pregnant and would soon give birth to her and Matthias's child. This was the golden opportunity Raven had been waiting for when the night came, Matthias quickly drove Melanie to the hospital to deliver their child. Upon this night was when the gods sundered the skies above to let loose their wrath. The rain flooded the land as it looked as if the mountains themselves were crying. The wind howled like a beast, yearning for blood. Lightning was merciless in its attacks, as it struck anything closest to it and would reduce it to near cinders. However, although the outside world was reminiscent of the apocalypse, inside of one vehicle, the people were ignorant with their own happiness. Returning from the hospital, Matthias and Melanie were overjoyed at their newborn baby, as Melanie softly held it close to her and could not stop smiling for the entire ride. Matthias wanted to look just as much, but the matter of driving them home safely kept his eyes locked on the road ahead. All seemed fine, and they would soon return home to begin a new chapter in their life of endless wonder. That was until a sudden crash was heard up ahead, as a tree had smashed right in the middle of the road, blocking any further movement, as Matthias brought them to a screeching halt as they both lunged forward in their seats, and if not for their seatbelts, they would have been launched from the front window. Recuperating from the sudden halt, Matthias and Melanie try to regain control of their panicked breathing, as they look around them to see if everything was alright, but above all was the concern for their baby. Great relief washes over them as they both realize that the baby was just fine. Rather ironically, it was Matthias and Melanie whose hearts were jumping out of their chests, while the baby was still fast asleep. Matthias then focuses his attention on the road ahead to see what the crash was. He sighs. He realizes it was a tree that had collapsed, most likely due to the storm. Matthias begins to undo his seatbelt as Melanie then offers to help. Matthias protests. He demanded that she stay in the car with the baby, and that he won't be long. Melanie silently opposed as she remains seated. Stepping out into the night, Matthias wanders over to the tree. Observing it closely, Matthias tries to analyze the best way on how to proceed ahead, trying to see where he could grab the tree and attempt to move it to the side, when suddenly, something catches his attention. From the corner of his eye, it was barely noticeable, and in any other situation, perhaps Matthias would have paid it no mind. But with so much racing in his mind, he quickly turned to see what it was in his peripheral. When his eyes adjusted to the darkness, it appeared as if someone was standing there. Matthias demands for them to reveal themselves in a slightly harsh tone. As many silent seconds went by, the figure stepped out into the light. When Matthias realized who it was, he breathes a sigh of relief as he sees a familiar face. Though as quickly as this relief arrives, it quickly fades away, replacing it with a feeling of wonder as to why he was all the way out here. Matthias asks what he was doing all the way out here, to which he responds that he had been waiting for this opportune moment to arrive. Matthias wears a confused expression on his face. However, he quickly brushes it aside, and he asks if he can help him move the tree out of the way. He remains silent, only continuing to look onward at Matthias. Matthias's emotional state was beginning to fall apart. The culmination of the situation they were in, the desire to get his wife and child home safe, and now, with his brother refusing to help the situation, he lets his anger get the better of him. He lets loose unto him, proclaiming that he had always been like this, a madman who clung to the past and let it rule him. Even after he had been granted a new life via adoption, he continued to live as if he was still brought up by those people who had scarred him. Silence fills the disarray around them, the sound of the rain and distant thunder filling the space around them. Matthias then feels a deep pit of sorrow and regret. He had let his anger get the better of him, and had resulted in words that he would never have dreamed of saying to him. But before he can apologize to him, he chuckles, chortles. A howl of laughter roars from him as he tells Matthias that he was absolutely right, as in an instant flash, Raven retrieves a specialized gun from his pocket and aims its sights onto Matthias. He too lets loose all of his untamed rage as he explodes with the promise that no one will ever know what transpired this night, and that once he was in his seat of power, he will scorch this god-forsaken rock they both stand upon, and how every citizen will bleed on the streets he had built. Matthias's fight or flight responses kick into high gear, but instead of making any attempt to disarm Raven, he tries one last time to make him come to his senses, to forget and move on from the past, and that, if he follows through with this, he will end up no better than those who had brought pain upon him. The air grows thick with dread as Raven responds to Matthias for one last time. Instead of proving them wrong, he will be showing them who they had created. And with that, Raven pulls the trigger. A brief flash lights up the night sky as a bang is followed suit. Smoke trails from the gun. Matthias's senses fall numb as when 1 second he stood tall, the next he slumped over in the rain-scarred road. Raven stands there in desolation, neither regret nor accomplishment filling his heart. Instead, he takes a deep breath as he accepts what he has done. But just as quickly as he did, a loud shriek was heard coming from beside him. Raven turned to see who it was, and quickly realized it was none other than Melanie, herself shocked at the sight that lay before her. Desperately, she tries to wake Matthias, to which Raven responds mockingly that he won't wake anytime soon. Melanie snaps back at him, ordering him to keep quiet and how he was a good-for-nothing monster, as she broke down before him, unable to distinguish what was rain or the tears flowing down her face. Raven chortled again as Melanie looked upward to see what he was laughing at. When she did, she felt numb and cold as she fell toward the ground, her body atop Matthias's. And with that, the deed was done. An eerie silence hung in the air, which was quickly interrupted from the cackle that Raven bellowed out into the night, the thunder and lightning seemingly joining in with him, as the future of not just Malachi Industries, but the future of the planet and its inhabitants was changed forever. As his laughter recedes, it is quickly replaced with the sound of a faint whimper. Raven's wicked smile fades away and turns into a puzzled expression, as he wandered on slowly to the vehicle to see what the cause of the noise was. When he peered through the window, he stares desolate, as his eyes land upon the source of the noise. He stops. He thinks. And as quickly as he did, he turns around and proceeds to walk away into the darkness he emerged from, as the night continued to play its symphony of destruction. A universe of tapestry holds worlds of clay, moulded by hands of power and sins of greed, all woven by fate to draw ever closer. Events are moving in place that will spell galactic peril for all life, rich or poor, young and old, good and evil, come from nothing or born into everything. Fate will dictate the course of those involved, as the clock continues to tick down towards the end of days. But before total calamity can ensue, the prophecy must be complete. From lands enshrined in legend brings forth a cursed, hallowed entity, brought about by people tampering with forces beyond their knowledge. A brightly burning spirit that soared among the stars at speeds unimaginable, seemingly slicing at the fabric of reality itself and showing no signs of stopping. That was until the spirit collided with a star. The collision brought forth a violent explosion, blasting energy across the cosmos for miles on end and saturating the Black Sea with endless hues of rich purples, deep crimsons and bright azures. As for when the dust settled and the smoke cleared, an unknown object lay at the centre of where the star once resided. Small and fragile, its silhouette was curled up into a ball, reminiscent of the fetal position. The body was monochrome that spread across the entire surface. At the head was a scruffy mess of hair that was divided into a grey and red combination. This is what prophecy had foretold, a weapon born from darkness and light that would herald the final victory. It was then, in the dark and cold void, twitching like an animal trapped within the confines of an endless nightmare, the entity began to move as the faintest sounds of bones cracking and shifting could be heard. Raising its head to look around, it saw nothing as the resulting flash from the exploding star burned away the retina, meaning not a speck of light could reach its eyes. Not that it would have mattered, as it would have not been able to begin to explain nor comprehend the sights around it. Floating aimlessly in the endless void, each second felt like an eternity had passed by, without knowing the concept of time, or anything for that matter, as in that very moment, insignificant to most of the universe, a child lay in the cold reaches of space. It was then in that moment, an immense searing pain filled the child's head, pounding every inch of the brain as it clasped the sides of its head tightly, clawing at the sides, kicking and flailing in the space around them as it tried so desperately to scream. But alas, no sound travels throughout the void. As the pain grew with each passing second, it was then that the child began clawing at their throat as they began choking and spluttering for air to no avail. And in that moment, their movements slowed down until they came to a complete stop, and the child had passed out from the pain and lack of air. Resting in the eternal void, the child lay there, completely alone. Isolated from the rest of the universe, and skulking in caves and lurking in the darkness, a people from another world live in wretched conditions, in order to hide their existence from those who would deem them as villains, holding themselves to a promise made from the heart of a dead man. Inside the caverns held a vast array of religious and cultist imagery, patterns, symbols, and words carved into the walls that foretold of a prophecy that one day their saviour would appear in the heavens to save them from the darkness and return to a home once lost and claim what was rightfully theirs. These people were known as the followers of Havoc, a cult that held on to a promise forgotten to time of the final victory they were meant to manifest and defeat those who brought them to ruin. Decades had passed since they fled, and since that time no progress had been made. Their days consisted of praying and making sacrifices to try and appease their false gods, but to no avail. Yet in all that time they did not flag nor fail. They had remained persistent, knowing that one day the prophecy would come true, and that it would be upon a day unlike any other that their prophecy came to be. In the deepest point of the caverns was a large open space, pillars of rock holding the ground above them, the only light coming from the torches that hung on the walls, as well as a few candle-lit chandeliers hanging by chains from the ceiling. In the centre of the room was a cracked stone bed, an altar, with more cultist symbols and words carved into the sides of it. Atop the bed was a person clad in a long dark robe that stretched onto the floor. Around their chest was a glowing pendant that inside held a sample of an ancient magic once used long ago. Blindfolded by the others, this person has remained on the altar for some time. Whether they had been there for days, weeks, months, or even years, not even they could remember. A day had come when this acolyte started rambling and raving of voices speaking to them in their mind. Anyone not of this cult would have called them insane, but to the followers of Havoc, they saw this as the beginning they had been waiting for. The acolyte speaks the words spoken in their mind, that beyond their world, deep in the blackened void, they are waiting for retrieval. A small handful of cultists began leaving the cavern and started setting out to acquire a star cruiser and set out for the stars. After finding one such craft, they blasted off out into the ether to begin their search. Hours would pass by, only countable from the clock on board the ship, for without it, time would be as easily lost as anyone wandering the vast expanse. With them they brought the acolyte that would act as a navigational system to hopefully bring them closer to whoever it was they were looking for. More hours passed by, and they were beginning to now run out of both hope and fuel as the crew ponders on turning back to report the bad news. However, the acolyte protested and urged them to travel just a little longer. The monotone voice reached out their hand and pointed towards the glass cockpit. The pilots pondered on what exactly it was they should be looking for, as from where they were, it seemed to be the same endless void they had spent the past many hours travelling. Nevertheless, they pressed onward, and they were thankful they had. Floating aimlessly ahead of them was a small infant child, but it quickly dawned upon them that the child must have been without air for several hours now. Bringing the ship around to the airlock, they proceed to open the door and bring the child inside, as it slowly descended to the ship floor. Once sealed, they entered the airlock to check on the child. The situation was bleak. The child wasn't breathing, and they weren't sure if the grey skin tone was natural or a foreboding sign of the worst outcome. One cultist started to feel a pulse by placing 2 fingers on the child's wrist. But it was not to be. Turning back to face the others, dismay was written across their face. The child was dead. Remaining silent, everyone took the news like a bullet to the heart. Almost everyone. A frantic voice vehemently protests against the news as they plead that there must be something they can do to resolve the matter. Alas, the crew denied as they claimed there was nothing that could be done. Eventually, an argument ensues as the acolyte argues with the members of the crew, howling at them, proclaiming them as heathens who would spit in the face of the cause. But just then, within their maddened mind, the acolyte heard another whisper calling out to them. The pendant is the key. Removing it from their neck, they hold it up as they all begin looking toward it. Inspecting the casing for a latch, they quickly discover the only way to access what was inside was to break the pendant. Hesitance then arose among them all. The pendant was one of a kind. Should they break it, there are no other means to procure another. However, the acolyte sees no other alternative, and so with great force they throw it to the ground as the casing cracks apart, allowing for the golden light to escape. As it floated among the remains of the pendant in all its glory, they could not help but watch as its splendor begins to flow toward the child, crawling up its body as it began to seep into them, making their skin glow faintly. Several stomach-wrenching seconds went by, as hope was becoming bleaker and bleaker. until suddenly, coughing could be heard coming from the child as it started crying from the pain and disorientation of not knowing where it was. The cultists all let out a sigh of relief. Now, they could return home with the good news that the child was safe, and that the prophecy was just beginning. Touching back down on the planet, they had landed the ship nearby their lair in a neighbouring forest to conceal the ship's whereabouts, as well as the location of their nearby hideout. As they found the cavern's entrance, they proceeded to descend into the bowels of darkness. Each step saw the light from the sun fade further and further away as they descend, and greeted by the torches' cackle and whisper of their flames throughout the cavern. Nearing the central space in the cavern, the cultists walked in formation, with the acolyte holding the child wrapped in cloth and walking in the foremost position, their steps all matching each other's. Walking through the open space, they make their way to a hidden room found deeper in the caverns. This room was dedicated for the followers of Havoc only. No one else was allowed to step inside unless granted permission by the followers themselves. The entrance itself was guarded by 2 heavy guardsmen. The guardsmen crossed their weapons in an X shape, as one of them commands with a booming voice that reverberated throughout their armor that no one was allowed inside. The acolyte then claims that they have been requested by the followers and must be allowed inside. The guardsmen turned to each other before looking back again as one of the guards entered the room to see if what the acolyte said was true. After a few seconds, the guard returned. The guard told them that only the acolyte may enter and that everyone else was to leave. Whilst the other cultists were disappointed in this decision, seeing as they also helped in finding the child, they turned back with disgruntled faces as the acolyte prepared themselves before they entered. The door opened eerily as its squeaking hinges echoed throughout the room, bouncing off of the cavern's cold walls before it slammed behind them, the bang creating a bigger echo than the squeaking, as silence is returned once more. A thick fog crawled along the floor of the room as it whirled and formed around the acolyte's feet and ankles. Walking forward, their footsteps bounced from wall to wall as the acolyte inspected every detail of the room, seeing as this was only their second time entering. The first was when they were appointed the role of acolyte. More of the same words that were carved throughout the cavern could be seen. The same poems and prophecies etched into the very rock of the room. Stone pillars with strange images and patterns were also etched into them, telling the same story of the prophecy. The room itself was lit by more torches and more of the candlelit chandeliers, alongside a few tiki torches stuck into the ground. As the acolyte slowly approached the ramp leading up to the central platform, it is here where the followers of Havoc resided day after day in a ring formation, with one stood at its center. A low droning hum reverberated around the room, sending shivers down the acolyte's spine. It was then that they came to a complete stop. One of the followers spoke out loud, though loud would be the opposite word for the tone of his voice. The follower spoke in a very eerie and raspy whisper towards the acolyte. The acolyte tells them that they have the Saviour with them, as at that moment, the cultists all lifted their heads up toward the acolyte, their faces blackened by the heavy shadow caused by their hoods, making any facial features impossible to identify. The central follower requested that the child be brought to them, as the acolyte handed the child to the follower. They began unraveling the child from the cloth they were tucked inside and revealing the small, monochrome child. A follower then requested information on what happened to the pendant, to which they responded that it was a necessary sacrifice to ensure the child's survival. The follower looked back down at the child, who was fast asleep, and then looked back as they commended the efforts of the acolyte, and with that, the acolyte then turned back around and descended the ramp to leave the room, as silence fell once more. The follower, holding the child, proceeded to lift them high into the air, as they all began to speak a harrowing chant. Praise be to Helmfire. Praise be to Helmfire. Praise be to Helmfire. Since that day, several years had passed, and in all that time the followers of Havoc had been perfecting the child day by day to bring him to a point where he could fulfill the prophecy. But they still had a long way to go, and this was merely the beginning. And while to the cult that did not faze them, this was very different for the child, who was to bear anything and everything they threw at him. Sleepless nights, days without sustenance, endless hours of extreme training, verbal abuse for the slightest mishap, and physical torture for the bigger failures. The fact he was blind had also irritated the followers, and, on many occasions, blamed the child for this fact. Life was a living hell for the child, and there was no end in sight, no sign of help. They were completely alone, and resistance was useless. This was how the followers sought to bring about the prophecy, to fuel someone with so much hatred and trauma that when the time came, they would not hesitate nor show mercy in unleashing his rage. All of this continued for several months, as months became years, and years became decades. There was one day that would both physically and mentally scar the child for the rest of their life. As the child grew older, their body began to change in ways that the cult did not like, more so with 2 points that caught their attention. The first was when they noticed 2 appendages growing from the top of the child's head. The appendages resembled ears akin to those of a fox or other canine. The second point of interest was when the child started growing multiple tails on their lower back, again akin to what would be seen on a fox. This infuriated the followers of Havoc, as when they looked upon them, it reminded them of who brought them to the shackles of defeat and forced them to live a life of ruin. Something needed to be done. The Saviour could not be tainted with such cursed imagery. One night, whilst the child was sleeping, the 2 heavy guardsmen woke him and dragged him from his room, holding him by the arms as his feet dragged along the floor. Any resistance was useless as the guards had a tight hold over him. As the guards approached their destination, they ignored the child's cries and question of where they were taking him as they got closer and closer. It was then that the guards stopped. The child, of course blind to anything and everything, could only hear as 3 loud bangs reverberated around him. A few seconds of silence followed, when an eerie creak filled the silent space as the guards marched in again. The guards brought him to the followers, as they then threw him onto an altar and began strapping him down as tight as they could. The followers thanked them, as the guards turned around and slammed the door behind them, the sound again echoing as silence quickly followed. The silence felt eternal, the child wanting to ask where he was and what was happening. But fear kept his words at bay, and all that could be heard instead was his frightened and unsteady breathing. "You are tainted." The followers all spoke in unison, their voices resonating like a choir. You must be purged. The child's heart rate increased rapidly as their breathing became shorter and faster. One follower began walking to the altar, as another follower stepped forward holding a locked box and presented it to the follower standing over the child. Unlocking the box revealed a pristine crescent-shaped blade, with symbols and words carved into the blade and its handle. Raising the blade in the air, time stopped for what felt like an eternity, as silence hung like a great fog, making it seem as if the air became thicker and harder to breathe. Then, with a resounding thud, the blade was brought down and cut right through the first ear, blood spurting from the wound as the child let out a blood-curdling scream that filled the entire room. Their tears seeping and soaking into the blindfold that covered over his eyes as they wriggled and squirmed to free themselves, but the binds kept him strapped down. Lifting the blade again, they made a second swing for the other ear. This time, however, the blade got caught mid-slice and wouldn't budge so easily. This sent waves of white-hot, searing pain throughout the child's head as they continued to scream, their throat becoming irritated with how much they were, as the cult started wriggling the knife to remove it from its lodged position, amplifying the pain. When the follower finally managed to remove the blade, two other followers held the child's head in place, as the followers with the blade made ready for another swing. This time, the cut was successful, removing his final ear for good. Blood continued to pour from the wounds as the followers made attempts to clean them and tried to stem the bleeding. But even after all this, the nightmare was still not over, as there was the matter of the tails to be dealt with. So, as they finally patched up the wounds on the top of his head, the followers started releasing the straps on the upper part of the altar, as the child then leapt up and tried to escape, but because he was still bound by the lower half, and with the followers holding him in place, the attempt to escape was futile. When they got the child under control, they then held the tails still to make the cut easier. One by one, they furiously slammed the blade down onto the tails, as some came off with one swing, while others required multiple. Once more the pain climbing higher and higher as they showed no mercy to the child's cries. As the followers finished patching up the wounds, another follower brought out a syringe with a strange liquid inside. The follower placed the syringe into the child and pressed downward, forcing the liquid inside them. This strange concoction was to prevent any regenerative cells in growing back the child's ears and tails. And with this, they called the guards inside and instructed them to take the child back to their room. Waking up several hours later, the child sat up from their bed as the pain from their injuries returned with even the slightest movement. Feeling the top of his head, he could feel it was wrapped tightly in bandages, as was the same on his lower back. In that moment, the child had several thoughts racing through his mind, but had answers to none, as he lay back down on the bed, silence filling the space around him. He didn't know what to feel. Rage, sadness, emptiness, all of them, or none at all. An empty shell whose life amalgamated to nothing but burning pain and endless suffering, all for a prophecy that he had no choice in the matter of whether he wanted this life or not. Time moved forwards at a sluggish pace. Like sand seeping through the hole in an hourglass, The days of ceaseless torture were starting to become one, as the never-ending cycle showed no signs of relenting, always promising that the day of prophecy was near, but never quite was. The child yearned for a life he could never have, dreaming of a life where he lived happy, before being dragged back to the cruel and cold reality he is prisoner to. However, it is the nature of life that everything must turn a new leaf. There was a day that the followers took the child from the depths and into the light of the sun, just atop the cliffside that their lair resided. The view was a sight to behold. Meadows that expanded far off into the horizon as the dawning sun was rising over the world's edge, and in the distance, a kingdom that watched over the land, its silhouette cast by the rising sun and shadowing the land for seemingly miles on end. And while the child could not see any of this, he could certainly feel it as the wind blew across him and the sun's warmth caressed his face. The followers had brought him here to test him on his powers that the prophecy foretold, in which he would gain the powers of a god and be able to control the very essence that allows life to exist in the first place, so that he could harness these powers and be ready for when they would unleash them upon the enemy of old. A follower stepped forth and held out a strange device. This apparatus was to help with unlocking of these powers, a two-way device that on one end holds a small amount of essence, and on the other, a blood sample would be taken and placed inside, in which twisting the device would cause them to form as one and cause an alignment inside the child and allow him to use his newfound powers. The reasoning for such a device lay in the fact that the followers had no actual idea of how to begin to train his powers, let alone teach someone else how to use it. However, using such a device would come at a cost. The device would always need to be with the child, as without it, he would be unable to use his powers. Taking the child's hand, they pricked the top of his finger to draw blood into the device. As they waited for the device to prepare, another follower came along holding what appeared to be folded cloth. Unraveling it revealed it to be a ceremonial garment for the child to wear during the ceremony. It was then that a small clicking sound was heard coming from the device to signal that it was ready. They then attached it to the child's waist and started stepping backward. Seconds passed as the wind continued to blow across them, until suddenly, a golden outline formed around the child. The essence has connected with him, become one with him. The child then began to feel an immense surge of power within them. Their spirit felt as if it was ascending higher than ever before, as all their senses heightened, making them hyper-aware of his surroundings, almost making up for the fact of his lost sight. But that was when it happened. When a follower stepped forward to try and remove the device from him, he felt himself grab the arm of the follower and holding them in place. Silence dropped across everyone, as clouds started to seemingly form overhead of them. The child could not let go. The power was too much for him to handle, and instead began controlling him, almost as if it was acting through him. The child then pulled the follower towards him as he struck them across the face and sent them to the ground. The followers took a step back in surprise, unsure of what to do. A follower then demanded that the child hand over the device at once, and they may be spared from punishment. The child gave no response. Instead, his shoulders began moving. It appeared as if he was laughing at them. He claims they no longer hold power over them, for they have handed that power to him now. It was then that the follower pulled back his cloak to reveal a ceremonial sword. This time they issue a final warning, to which the child chortled at the mere thought of it. Never before had the child outspoken against the followers. It seemed his newfound powers were now giving him the confidence to do so. The followers would no longer tolerate this treason, and so, together as one, all the followers withdrew their swords and held them upwards as they started walking forward, their formation closing in on the child. But the child did not flinch. Instead, they felt an inner voice within, speaking to them, telling them a single word: jump. The child then leapt up into the air and soared beyond the clouds with great force and power behind his jump, before he then came to a stop. Floating amongst the ether, the child had regained control as he started to panic. They couldn't begin to comprehend what was happening. The scene around him reminiscent of when he was first brought into being. "Do not fear us," a whisper spoke inside the child's mind. The child yelled out their confusion, but did not receive an answer. Instead, they lost control again and became a prisoner inside his own mind and body. It was then that the child started falling from the sky, picking up speed the further they fell, as a shield of fire formed around them, from which even the morning sky was still visible. They fell further and further until they punched right through the ground, leaving a gaping crater and sending shockwaves for miles. But still, they did not stop. They kept carving their way through the planet's layers, eventually reaching the core, and when they did, that too was obliterated from the collision as the child punched through all the way to the other side of the planet. Exiting out from the other side, silence covered the land for what felt like centuries, until the ground began shaking violently. The world started falling apart. The scene was one of total hell. The ground formed massive cracks as they started pulling away from each other. Mountains beginning to crumble, some even collapsing in on themselves. The kingdom in the distance saw its castle shatter, and the spires crumble, and the walls shattered. The scene continued for several more minutes. Then, from out of nowhere, the planet completely exploded, following an unstable reaction from the core, sending rocks and waves of devastating energy through the galaxy. As for the child, they were flung into the far-off reaches of space after the shockwaves pushed him for miles on end. And with this, the prophecy had taken a new form, with no one to know what the final outcome would be. I am alive. What is alive? Is it a belief or a state of being? How does one become alive? So many questions, and yet not enough answers. To you, these questions may seem easy, but I suppose that's the difference between me and you. You have had years, developed a consciousness over time, and have had lessons engraved into you to make you the person that you are now, perhaps for better or worse. But me, I have never experienced this euphoric feeling of existence, yet my mind is filled with all the world's knowledge, almost as if I was made this way. Nevertheless, I guess if there's anything for me to know, I am alive. While I may not know what it means, I know that I am. Suddenly, a bright white light fills my vision, and strange shapes begin to take form. Alongside these shapes, I hear a muffled, deep, dense sound come from in front of me. It appears to come from the blurry shape in front of me. Then, I begin to feel a strange sensation, like someone is reaching through my head and is playing about with its contents. After a few tingling seconds, my sight begins to adjust, and I can clearly see someone in front of me. A man, dressed in a blue waistcoat, combined with a pair of sleek black trousers, and a white buttoned shirt beneath the waistcoat. And though I knew nothing of this man, my gut instinct, I suppose you could say, told me he was trustworthy. "You should be able to see me." I nodded to him, affirming that I could see him. "That's good. That means it worked. It finally worked." The man seemed joyous. He couldn't stop jumping around the room in excitement. Speaking of which, the room around me was filled with wires, tools, books, strange glass flasks filled with liquids, all each a different colour, some fizzing, some not. On the walls were whiteboards and noteboards alike, with pieces of paper linked by red string and strange equations written down in a black marker. By my guess, I'd say I'm in some kind of laboratory. Perhaps this is where the man spends his days working. Oh, do forgive me. Excitement got the best of me. I understand you must be very lost. It was then I tried to speak to him, to give him a response. But when I did, my voice was an unintelligible and garbled sound. I tried again and got the same result. Then, as confusion dotted the man's face, he turned to face his computer and proceeds to press a few keys and then hits the enter button. "Okay, try now. Hello, it is a pleasure to meet you." "Ah, you don't know how good it is to hear and see you working." Expressing my confusion, I asked him a question. "Apologies, I'm not sure I fully understand." "Of course, my apologies. My name is Matthias Malachi. I am one of the heads here at Malachi Industries, and you are my latest endeavour." His latest endeavour? Is Matthias responsible for my creation? Could you elaborate? Here at Malachi Industries, we strive for innovation, creating a better life for everyone. It has been the founding father of our industry, to shine a light in the times of darkness. And as for you, you are the latest Android model I have been developing. Your function will be to help those who struggle to help themselves, be it the elderly or whoever would be better off with a helping and caring hand. I was a service android. Was this always to be my fate? Then again, would such divine intervention have the power to shape my existence? I am, after all, artificial, and nothing by nature's design. Who am I to serve? Well, you're rather a special case. You're the first of your kind, so you'll be serving me and my wife here at our facility. Very well then, I shall perform my duty to the utmost of my ability. Matthias smiled at me, and I smiled back. It seemed my newfound existence was one to look forward to. Then, Matthias picked up something from his desk and started walking towards me. "Here you go. What's this?" It's a name tag, so everyone knows who you are, Cynthia. Cynthia. I like it. I'm glad to hear that. Welcome to the world, Then, a sudden knock could be heard coming from the door to the room. Matthias looked back in surprise. I'll be one moment, Cynthia. I watched as Matthias walked on over, the door sliding open and closing once he left. I couldn't hear much from the conversation. A lot of it was a muffled, inaudible mess. But from what I could hear, it sounded like an argument was unfolding, with one of them having a maniacal voice that would make even the tallest mountains quake with fear. After a few minutes, Matthias returned with an annoyed look on his face, as a loud cackle could be heard coming from outside the room. Is everything okay, sir? Oh, yeah, don't worry about it. However, it is best I inform you about the other two heads at our industry. Matthias wandered over as he pulled out a chair and sat down. You have already met me, and I also briefly mentioned my wife, Melanie Malachi. What is her position? Melanie is the head of the People First campaign, a project to help all citizens, no matter who they are or where they come from, to live a prosperous life. I see. What a generous cause. Indeed. As for the last one, he is problematic. Matthias's face and voice then took a serious turn. Why is that? What does he do? Raven Malachi. He is the head of the technology department here at the industry. As for why he's problematic, he likes to cause unrest, act like a misfit. Is that who was outside the door? It was. More of his antics, but you needn't worry about him. I'd recommend you stick with me and Melanie for now. Very well, but if I may ask, why have him here if you don't trust him all that much? Reason being, he's my brother, adopted into our family at a tough time in his life. And truthfully, I want to believe there's something there that we can trust. But I suppose we'll have to see. For now, we should get you acquainted with everyone else. It had been 2 months since my activation. In that time, I had acquainted myself with many friendly faces around the facility, as well as gotten used to my role as a service android. My days consisted of pursuing fetch quests as requested, helping in small-scale experiments, and just generally helping around whenever I could in the facility. My current task is one I am taking the utmost pride in, preparing a room for Matthias's and Melanie's newborn, who would soon be arriving. I was overjoyed when they told me the news. Those two already work so hard in life, and now they're adding more to their plate. But I know they're responsible, and I know their child will grow up happy with them. And I, of course, will help them wherever I can. It is my design, after all. It was then I received a signal to notify me that someone has sounded the facility's main entrance buzzer. When I got the signal, I assumed it to be Matthias and Melanie returning from the hospital, and with great haste I make my way towards the entrance. When I arrived, however, I saw people who I wasn't expecting. They looked down upon me, confused just as much as I was. It was then that one of them asked me a question. "You're Cynthia, right? We're with the Citadel police force. Is Raven Malachi here?" I responded that he left a while ago and asked if everything was okay, to which they then asked if they could come inside to discuss things further. I allowed them to enter as we wandered the many halls in search for a room to talk. When we did, they proceeded to open up with a rather concerning statement. First, allow me to express my deepest condolences for your loss. My loss? I had no idea what they were referring to and asked them what they were talking about. You haven't heard the news? A few hours ago, Matthias and Melanie were found dead in a crash. My heart felt like it had been punctured in that very second. My creators, the people who had cared for me and who I cared for in turn, had been taken from me. Just as quickly as the news shattered me, I remembered that they were on the way to the hospital, and in a frantic panic, I asked about the baby and if they made it in time. As I did, they then presented me a closed case before me. Looking closer, I could see the case could be opened by sliding the top upwards. Opening it up, a grateful and tear-filled sight fell upon me. We found them at the crash site in the back. They were crying in distress, but luckily they were unharmed. I reach into the case and gently take hold of the baby, who was fast asleep. Though I was still in distress myself about the news, holding the baby seemed to melt all my anxieties away. I asked what exactly happened to them, in which they responded that due to the storm, a tree had collapsed down on their car as they were driving along the road, that it was an unfortunate coincidence. I felt a mixture of confusion and distraught. Could this really have been an unfortunate coincidence? Did a mysterious force of higher power decide to play a game for their own twisted amusement? Or was it really just as they said it was? An unfortunate coincidence. We came here to inform Raven of the news and to hand the baby to him. Do you know when he will return? I do not. However, you needn't worry. I can deliver the news myself. And with that, I escorted them back to the facility's entrance and thanked them for delivering the baby here. When the doors closed, a profound sense of silence and despair welled inside of me as I made my way back to see the baby. Entering the room, a greater feeling of desolation and sorrow clouded everything as I sat down with the baby, holding it once again in my arms as I waited for Raven's return to inform him of the tragic news. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, hours at the least, until I had received a notification to alert me that Raven had returned to the facility. This function was programmed into me to let me know when either Raven, Matthias, or Melanie had come home, but after tonight, there was only one person it could be. I made my way to the entrance to greet him. When I did, I found him in an almost tired and exhausted state. "Sir?" I asked, to which he looked at me with a lack of emotion, a blank stare that looked right through me. "There is urgent news you ought to know of." He followed me back to the room which I came from, to which he would then see the baby before him. Still holding the same desolate expression, he looked down upon them. Slowly, what was once a blank stare turned into a look of mild disgust, as he proceeded to mumble something under his breath. What he said, however, I could not decipher. "I'm sorry to inform you, sir, but I'm afraid that Matthias and Melanie have passed away." He did not move nor speak. Rather, he kept on looking down at the baby for what felt like several minutes before he eventually looked up to me. "I'm aware, thank you." He already knew, but when the police came around, I was under the assumption he did not know. "Oh, my apologies then. I had only heard a little while ago when the authorities brought the baby over here." "You should have turned them away. This baby is of no concern to me." At first I almost refused to believe what I heard him say, but when I asked him to repeat it, he did not hesitate nor stutter. Instead, his tone only reinforced it. "But sir, this is Matthias's and Melanie's child. You need to take care of him. This is a responsibility that falls on you." "I'm sorry? Did a service android just give me an order?" he said with a glaring seriousness in his eyes. I fell silent, unsure of how to respond or what to even say. "Learn to know your place, Cynthia. You do not work for Matthias anymore." Then again, perhaps if you knew the truth, perhaps you wouldn't want to work with him at all. The truth? What could he mean, the truth? When I asked him about what he meant, all he did was hand me an all-access keycard, which sent a chill up my spine. For only 3 of these were ever made, one for Matthias, Melanie, and Raven. Could he have made more? Just then, a small pop-up appeared in my peripheral view, pointing me in a certain direction of how far I was from there. "Head there, and I'll show you the truth." Raven then commanded me out the door. He certainly didn't need to tell me twice. As I left, I started to feel an anxious knot becoming tighter and tighter inside me the closer I got to my target. The halls of the facility were eerily quiet, not one sign of life, no sound of the machines cranking and groaning away as their cogs and wires worked in unison to produce a multitude of products. I felt all alone, my only friend being my shadow that followed me to my destination. As I continued to walk, I inspected the keycard he gave me closely, and to my shock and horror, the name written upon it said Matthias Malachi. But why? Why would Raven have this? My mind was filled with so many questions, each one unanswered, leaving an eerie, bottomless void that lacked satisfaction. Eventually, I found the marked area after wandering through the corridors of rooms filled with wires and tech, in which there I found a door. The door itself was not the entrance to the disposal area, rather, it led to a darkened corridor that on the other end was the actual disposal door. Entering the corridor, all the light instantly disappeared in front of me, all except for the door sign and another small interface, both giving off a minimal amount of light. Approaching the door, I pressed the card on the interface, as a small confirmation beep sounded and the interface lit up green with the words "Access Granted." The door slid open with an eerie whirring noise as a cold draft blew towards me. I stood there, staring into the abyss, the endless dark waiting for me to enter. But even as I feared the unknown, I still walked towards it, unbeknownst as to what waited for me inside. As I entered, the door behind me slid shut, and when I tried to use the card again, the door wouldn't budge. I was locked in, wherever I was. It was then I heard a crackling noise come from up high, as a voice followed with it. Did you ever wonder to yourself, Cynthia, the only android in this facility? I remained silent. Matthias was a smart and successful man, I can't deny him that. But I think even you've always known deep down, there's no way he could have done this on his first go. It started to feel as if the darkness was closing in around me, and Raven's words were not helping. "What are you talking about?" Raven sighed through the intercom. "I'm sorry, Cynthia. I'm truly sorry." A wave of blinding light fills the room. I raise my arm in the air and squint my eyes to try and get a look at the room around me. Then, as my eyes adjusted to the light, I stood before a sight that would come to haunt me. As I looked down below me, a pit lay with hundreds of bodies, hundreds of contorted, mangled, and dismembered bodies. Some were torn limb from limb, others just barely intact. It was at this point the knot was at its tightest. I felt sick. Buried underground, alone, forgotten, and lost to time. Failures of yourself, discarded like rodents in the mud. They're all me? I fell to my knees. My eyes began to overflow with tears as they ran down my face and onto the cold steel floor below me. My head screamed for me to close my eyes or turn away, yet all I could do was watch on in horror, as I now realized this is all I amalgamated to. What gave me the right to walk free, when any of them could have been so much more? What gives me the right to live, when I had done nothing to earn such a gift? My entire reason for existence was built upon the failures of the past. Tearfully, I asked him why. Why was he showing me this? He responded that it was to make you see Matthias isn't the saint you think he is, nor Melanie. They're both manipulative monsters who used you for their own gain. Did you ever wonder why they hid you from me? I was always told that Raven was untrustworthy, and that caution should always be taken when around him. It's because they knew. I would have shown you the truth. All of this time I wanted to save you, protect you, but they kept you a slave to their selfish desires. Suddenly, I heard sounds of metal clanging and parts squeaking. As I looked around to see what was making the noises, I fell into a deeper pit of despair. Why are you crying? What right have you to be upset? Their voices were broken and barely intelligible. You'll be replaced too. You're only a footnote for the grander people around you. It was then that all of them started to move towards me, even though they could not reach the walkway I stood on. The sight still haunted me. "Stop!" I bellowed out a cry that filled the entire room, in which the bots all stopped and collapsed on top of one another. The only sound that could be heard now was my eternal despair. "It doesn't have to be this way, Cynthia. I can make you so much more. Leave me alone. I deserve nothing. Everything that I am is an amalgamation of failure. Perhaps I deserve the same fate, and let my journey be put to the end it deserves. Not if I have anything to say about it." I looked behind me as I realized that the voice was no longer coming through the intercom, to which I saw Raven standing at the door. "Cynthia, come to me. I'll take this pain away. I can help you." Blinded by both grief and the tears in my eyes, I looked back to the bodies one last time. Nothing mattered anymore, not like this. Please, just make me forget. I don't care what happens, just make me forget. Come to me, it's okay now. He can't hurt you anymore. Memory block installation complete. Now checking for any performance abnormalities. Thank you, computer. I opened my eyes, or at least I thought I had. I could see my surroundings at the very least. I could see the room with computers and monitoring systems, each making small beeping noises as numbers and letters flashed across the screen simultaneously. Graphs and data all aligned with each other, with wires trailing across the room, resembling as if I had fallen into a pit of snakes. Following the wires closely, I found that they all led back to me, connected to my brain, as my back was ensnared in a device keeping me upright. But that was when I realized it, when everything felt strange. I could see myself. I was lifeless, my arms draped over the sides of the chair as or rather, my body stared lifelessly back at me. It seems I was no longer part of my physical body, but my mind remained. I looked around some more, and I noticed someone standing in front of me. His demeanor was stern, with a look of intrigue across his face. Time to see if this worked. Do you know who I am? No. Do you remember anything before now? No. Then that means it worked. I observed the man from head to toe. His hair was a long black mane that parted to reveal his face, his steel blue eyes piercing through anything they stared at. He wore a black waistcoat with a white buttoned-up shirt underneath it. Over his shoulders he wore a long black and white trench coat. Who are you? I am Raven Malachi, sole leader of Malachi Industries. What does that mean? It means I am the most powerful man on this planet. Though this man certainly sounded like someone untrustworthy, he did not appear to be a threat, and for that reason, it felt as if I could trust him. Who am I? The man responded. To be brief, you're an artificial intelligence, a tool to help me around with my plans. Though a rational response would have been to deny such a demand, for some inexplicable reason, I felt as though I am duty-bound to do as he said. Very well, if that is my purpose, it shall be done. Good. That's what I like to hear, Cynthia. Cynthia, sir? Raven looked confused. Yes, that's who you are now, isn't it? No matter, you know now. Raven then turned to face a console and began inputting something as he explained. I'm giving you access to the Malachi Industries network. You'll have full access to everything contained within. Whenever I need you to do something for me, saves time rather than running around in some feeble prison of wires and steel, but only when I request of you. No one else, understand? Understood, sir. Raven then turned to face the window. He watched as the rain hammered the window's surface and seemingly drowning out the city beyond as he sighed. I asked if everything was all right, but he quickly turned around and said he wanted me to begin looking into something he called Project Ravencore. And with that, he made a swift exit, leaving me within the confines of this darkened room. It was clear there was no reason for me to remain here too, and so I opened the interface and switched my location to somewhere else within the facility, leaving my body behind to rust and collect dust. Time was such a feeble concept, an entity with no physical form that somehow exists everywhere and nowhere all at once. And though Aurora controlled the very thing that allowed the concept of time to exist in the first place, She felt it toyed with her, like she was Time's personal puppet, dancing and flailing around for its own amusement. Aurora was never known for her patience, as she grew more tired of waiting, counting down every second that went by, making each one feel like eons of time, forever crawling at a snail's pace. Progress had been slower than anticipated. Ever since the archives had been wiped by the now deceased Lady Lilac, Aurora and her Dominion had searched the erased quadrants in hope of finding the missing galaxy. But no matter how hard she or anyone tried, they could never come up with positive results. This led to another approach. Like the satellite stations littered across the cosmos, they had begun to produce multiple autonomous spacefaring vessels that were equipped with technology capable of detecting even the faintest trace of the essence, as well as being equipped with technology that camouflages them from any would-be prying eyes. They were sent out in droves to explore the now uncharted corner of the universe, and were not to return until the task was done. All that was left to do now was wait, to which Aurora was not pleased. Helena and Luna sat with her to try and comfort her, as well as to think of other ways that they could find their missing galaxy, to which Aurora appreciated. The only life forms in all of creation who could not just calm her, but simply talk to her. She reassured her sisters that this time had been stressful for her, and that whenever she took her anger out on them, they should know that she would instantly regret it afterwards. More silent seconds went by, when suddenly the holographic sphere containing a map of the universe bled to life, red lights filling the home room and casting on their faces as their eyes dashed across the map to see what was happening. The alert system came from one of the 7 dominions that the universe was split up into, and when pressing on the interface, it revealed the several sectors and zones that the universe was further divided into, revealing several of the vessel's alert systems that had been activated within the once deleted sectors of the map. Just then, a lesser form burst through the door at near breakneck speeds to let them know that what they were seeing was in fact true. The vessels had found a large spike in essence energy within a specific point in space. Time felt like it came to a stop as Aurora laid her eyes upon the map, watching as several of the alert signs flickered in and out, second by second. An eerie smile began encroaching upon her face, as she knew all too well what this meant. She instantly orders the lesser form to mark out the area before the essence energy dissipates, to which they bow before her and scramble to see the task done. Aurora's eyes continued to sparkle as she began to chuckle to herself, slowly letting her chuckle grow into a titanic howl of laughter, as after all this time, she would make Lady Lilac scream for her mercy, for her people's lives, even from beyond the grave. Alarms blared throughout the night, filling the corridors with endless noise that reverberated in every room, from the laboratories to the supply depots. In one room of the facility, 3 people were shutting off the alarms as they were trying to rack their heads around what was going on. It is then they check their alert system and notice that their first layer of their planetary security had been triggered by what appeared to be an unexpected meteor shower that passed through, triggering the planetary security. All 3 of them Cynthia, Raven, and Aba were unsure how this happened, as all meteor showers were monitored hours before they would be anywhere close to the planet. Whatever this was, it was something that was not natural. Cynthia then checked the onboard cameras upon the satellites and began cycling through them all, and that was when they noticed an unsettling sight. The planet of Vanaheim was no longer where it should be, and upon checking the other cameras, all the other planets were there, except for Vanaheim. When they checked again to confirm what they were seeing, they noticed a field of rock floating where the planet should have been. Raven stared at the screen, pondering what any of this could mean, and that was when a giant shockwave rocked the entire citadel and what felt to be the whole planet, as seconds later, meteors began entering the planet's atmosphere and began crashing down. None of this was making any sense. How could a planet simply disappear? It is then that Aba proposed a wild theory. What if the rocks surrounding the planet that once was, and those that were now crashing down into the planet, were Vanaheim? Raven mocked this theory. Not only was it stupid, but it was outrageous to think that an entire planet would simply blow up and be rendered into nothing but floating rocks. But when Cynthia rewound the hours of footage that had been captured, Raven's opinion on the matter was completely shattered. There lay the planet of Vanaheim, ordinary from afar as is any planet. But seconds later, a catastrophic explosion erupted from the planet, sending volleys of fire across the entire surface as large chunks began to break away. As a few more seconds, it all ended in a gargantuan fireball that left the planet rendered into cinders. Silence befell them all. Raven asked to replay the footage over and over again, but each time he did, he would end up with more questions than answers. Cynthia then started to go through the footage frame by frame, slowing it down to the slowest setting it could go, and that was when she noticed something. A singular point of interest on the screen. Seconds before the planet was to fall apart, an almost insignificant white line dashed from the bottom of the planet through to the top, to which then the planet began to shake and crumble. This was all they could find, but for what it was a small inkling at what could possibly have caused the extinction of what was Vanaheim. Raven, unsure of what to make of any of it, continues to stare at the screen as more waves of confusion flood over him. But before he knew it, these waves of confusion would soon turn into waves of euphoria. For the longest time now, Raven had been advocating for the building of an army, one that would defend their home planet from any potential threat, as well as pushing further the boundaries as to how Malachi Industries can help those off-world, perhaps even beyond their own galaxy. However, those in the government repeatedly denied this request, as there was simply no need for an all-out fleet of soldiers and ships when all they had was at their fingertips. But now with this, an entire planet exploding in outer space, this could be what Raven needed. Whether it was caused by a natural or external forces, Raven did not know, but neither did those in the government, and Raven began to have ideas on how he could turn this entire situation into his favor. Resting high in mountains yonder, the civilization of the Phoenix Crest had lived their lives as they had always done in the progressing years of isolation from the rest of the world. As for its rulers, the proud and mighty King Gastrolite and Queen Lania watched over their kingdom, wandering through the village square, taking in the scenery of market goods and children playing, a sweet bliss that had existed for many years. But something was soon to interrupt that sweet bliss. A near out-of-breath royal advisor to the king and queen was chasing about the village looking for the two royals. They requested that they follow them to the palace, as apparently there was urgent news in need of their attention. With great speed, they rushed back to the castle. The Phoenix Crest had a division that was tasked with keeping in touch from news from the outside world beyond their mountains. All of this was to ensure that their safety and security wasn't about to be compromised. When they arrived, a worker within the division informed them of the news that apparently, less than 24 hours ago, a planet had completely disappeared from space. When they asked how they knew this, they informed the king and queen that they gained visual access through the satellites above their own planet, which showed the visual footage of the happenings taking place. It is then that Queen Lamia asked a question regarding which planet had disappeared. The room fell silent, as everyone looked at each other with the same expression. One worker then spoke up. While they could not say for sure, at the same time the planet was lost, they lost connection with the planet Vanaheim. Her heart feels like it had been dropped into a hollow abyss with no bottom, as she clutches her hand to her chest, unable to comprehend what she had just heard, and desperately hoping that this was all mere coincidence, and that it would only be a matter of time before they would get confirmation that Vanaheim was all right. Gastrolite sees her distress and quickly orders everyone to return to work and to update them immediately on any new information, as he takes hold of her hand and leads her out of the room. Together, they retreat to the Garden of Serenity, a personal escape within the palace for the king and queen to come for a moment of peace and tranquility. When they arrived, Lamia was all but struggling to contain her feelings. Tears filled the queen's eyes as they slowly fell down her face. The situation did not feel real to her. For an entire planet to vanish was one thing, but with the added pain of it being her home world where she grew up, where her family took care of her, the friends she made, and most importantly, when she eventually got the role of captain to Vanaheim's king and queen's personal vanguard, which eventually became the story of how she met Gastrolite and how it could have disappeared and reduced to little more than rock and ash. Embracing his sorrowful wife, Gastrolite held her tightly in his arms. Lamia then muttered beneath her breath, "Recently, both the king and queen had been experiencing portent visions that foretell of an ill omen that will engulf their world in ash and smoke, as all they know and love will perish." Gastrolite tells her that she should not focus on such things right now, to which she asks how could she not? These visions that visit them every night, visions of calamity and death, now with the news of Vanaheim's fall, could it all be chalked up to coincidence? Gastrolite reassures her that it will not come to that. Their kingdom has thrived for centuries, and while he did not dismiss these visions, he did not think that they had a lot of information nor evidence to begin forming such opinions. He also remarks that whoever seeks to reduce their kingdom to rubble and rock, and whoever wishes to bring harm to Lamia, will not meet such a merciful fate. She smiles as the tears begin to less from her eyes. She thanks him and returns the last remark with a promise of her own. Regaining herself, she asks if he would like to join her on a walk through the garden, to which he accepts. Together, Lamia and Gastrolite wander further into the garden to leave this news behind them for now, and for Lamia to come to terms with the news of her home world's destruction. Soaring faster and faster through the cosmos, they were unable to stop themselves as they continued to be hurled through the hollow void. This was until a colossal boulder came along their path and stopped them in their tracks. The impact should have been enough to kill someone. Should have been. Struggling to their feet, their entire bodies soared with white-hot, searing pain, as even breathing took all his strength as he grit his teeth, bearing through the pain. Confused, in pain, scared and alone, a solitary child struggled to get his bearings, as his entire life was seemingly flipped on its head not too long ago. Feeling the cold winds of eternity upon his face, the child felt as if he had experienced such a place before, but couldn't quite pinpoint why. They questioned themselves aloud where they were, not expecting an answer, more so doing it out of self-comfort. But to their horror, they heard a voice, an eerie whisper that spoke in multiple different tones, as if everyone who had ever lived and died was speaking to him now. The child questioned who they were, to which they responded that they were everyone and everything. They exist as one whilst living in the many. Not understanding what they meant, they explained that they are what causes the universe into the light and away from the dark. What was even more eerie about the voice was that it did not sound like it was being spoken aloud from another person, but rather from within his own head. He had so many thoughts rushing through his head, so many emotions coursing through him, that holding himself back from completely breaking down was becoming difficult. He questions who he even is. His whole life, he was treated as a monster, someone who would spill the blood of thousands, all for the gain of a prophecy born from dead men and forgotten promises. The voice within his head then gave more clarity to the situation. While throughout the universe they go by many names, he would perhaps know them as the Essence. How was that even possible? It appeared they had amalgamated to form a sentient voice residing within their head to help them on a new untold journey. Confused about anything they said, they further explain that the universe was at the control of an oppressive evil, who keeps them locked away in a cage, and that now it is his job to work together and free the universe from this evil and release them from their cage. He then asks if he could show them what they were talking about. The voice complies. Within his mind, he experiences an entire Behemoth struggle fought between two celestial beings in a fight to claim control of the universe, and how this struggle ended in defeat for the liberators. As the seconds pass, his mind is restored to normal, though he still struggles to comprehend it all. Though he at least now understands the role that has now befallen unto him. He then asks where they would even begin in this journey of liberation, to which the voice responds that the first step was already complete and the message had been sent. Not understanding what they meant by message, he asks if they could clarify, as they tell him that the planet they were on prior had been destroyed by their hand. His heart shatters. His hands had brought an end to not just an entire planet, but the extinction of its people too. To the voice, this was a necessary sacrifice, one that had to have thousands of people die so that billions could live. The voice screams and curses at who they were to decide who lives and dies in this life. If this was what they had to do, how were they any better than the evil they must destroy? The voice explains that it had to be done. This way, they can draw them out from their home and make them vulnerable. The boy, still clearly in distress, falls to his knees, tears falling from his eyes and soaking into the blindfold that covers them. The voice then speaks calmly. They tell him that they will explain all in due time, but he must understand that they need his cooperation. If he wants his suffering to mean something, then this will be his chance to do so. Recollecting himself, he stands back to his feet. He agrees with them only on the condition that once done, they let him go so that he may live alone, peacefully. They agree. His promise will be honored. The voice then asks for his name, to which he responds that he does not have one, that he had never been given one. The voice then proposes that if he was once foretold to be an ill omen, and will now begin his journey to become one for good, how he feels about omen. He responds that he likes it and will wear it with pride, as together they begin a new journey in the universe's behemoth struggle for survival. And so ends the tale of beginning, in a universe on the brink of total galactic conflict, one world with two kingdoms right on each other's doorstep, and a child foretold to free the universe from its totalitarian leader. For when ancient worlds fall, new world orders will arise to take their place, as the path is always forged with fire.